After reviving Tsukasa, who has now joined their party, Senku and his kingdom of science must gather vital resources from across the globe to reach the moon. First target, North America, where they'll establish Corn City, humanity's new hub for revival fluid production. But as more stone statues awaken, will the dream of space unite humanity, or will the revival of civilization plant the seeds of its own destruction? Let's find out. Minami used the voice recorder they had acquired. She first introduced herself as the star reporter Minami Hakutozai, stating that she was recording for posterity. According to her, their group was finally close to cracking the worldwide petrification mystery. Their group was aboard Perseus, the ship built by the Kingdom of Science. She explained that their final goal was to reach the enemy base on the moon. However, upgrading from Stone Age tools to a spaceship would be an enormous project. Therefore, they would travel around the world to gather resources. Their first stop would be the North American continent. She then announced that she would introduce the ship's crew members. Of course, she first interviewed Tsukasa, the strongest primate high schooler. He stated that once many people are revived, guns might resurface. He explained that some people would likely try to exploit and profit from others, and he wouldn't allow that. He declared that they must not defile science with blood, and that was his role in their project. Next introduced was Gin, the insincere mentalist. He claimed he had lived in the US for 10 billion years. He mentioned that the foreign women there were cute. Additionally, he brought up the Statue of Liberty, expressing curiosity about whether that copper lady was still standing. Minami became excited upon hearing it was made of copper, but it turned out Gin wasn't even sure about that fact. Annoyed by his random statements, Minami ended his interview. Moving on to their great detective, young Sui-Ka. She shared that they were angry when she had previously stowed away on the ship, but as a reward for her excellent performance on the island, she was given permission to come aboard this time. Therefore, she promised to be extremely helpful during their trip. Minami commented that she had never seen Sui-Ka being unhelpful. The godly artisan Kaseki then noticed that she was using his precious recorder. He asked if it was running now. The inspired science user Chrome added proudly that the device carves sound into a lacquered wooden tube. The lacquer, he said, was the reason why the recording process was smooth and nice. It was an inspired design that he himself created. Minami was surprised by their responses, as her question had been about how they felt about the voyage. She then moved to another crew member. Karisame, the straight-laced warrior with the throwing arm, answered that she was just assigned to help them, and she only wanted to follow that order. Minami remarked that she was being too serious and asked for her personal thoughts on the matter. Then Minami had a sudden thought. She suggested that Karisame seemed to get along with their other hard-headed crew member, Kinro, and asked what she had to say about that. Karisame suddenly blushed and said she knew nothing about that. Minami went out to ask Kinro, the straight-laced spear warrior, what he thought about Karisame. He replied that she was a skilled warrior, possibly even stronger than him. Therefore, he said they needed to train harder to keep up. However, he wondered how Ginro would fare without Matsukaza tending to his every whim. Matsukaza was the revenge-driven samurai. He clarified that he knew his lord was no longer in this world. He explained that the only one to blame was the Y-Man. Therefore, he planned to seek revenge. That was the reason he served the one he called Master Ginro, who looked exactly like his lord. He commented on the statement about him tending to his every whim, saying it was nonsense since he only carried him when his legs gave out. Moving to Ginro, he recalled getting bad leg cramps before they set sail. He explained that he had struggled because although he wanted to join this long, terrible, and miserable sea voyage, he couldn't do it. However, Matsukaza suddenly appeared to help, carrying him onto the ship. But now, he said his legs seemed fine again. Nevertheless, he complained that he was dying of boredom there. He asked how many more weeks they would be like this. As they sailed across the vast ocean with no end in sight, the weather suddenly turned bad. Lightning struck and waves raged, concerning the captain as he held the steering wheel. Ginro started crying, saying he couldn't take it anymore. He said that the hard work was killing him. He asked again how many more weeks it would be. The ship captain Ryusui answered that it would take 70 more days, but this contradicted what Senku, the science captain, said. According to him, it would only take 40 days. Their different predictions made it clear that they disagreed. Suika quickly ran outside to inform the others about the problem. Chrome and Taiju became concerned when they heard about the disagreement between Senku and Ryusui. Taiju intervened, saying that fighting wasn't good. However, Ryusui insisted they weren't fighting but merely having a discussion. Taiju then asked if Senku had dissed him. Senku replied that Taiju was right and that they were indeed fighting. This prompted Taiju to repeat that fighting wasn't good. The weather calmed somewhat, and Ukyo asked if they were arguing about the route to America. Senku confirmed that the submariner's guess was correct, saying he was right to the point. They discussed the direction they should take. They had shipped out from Tokyo with America as their goal, specifically San Francisco, according to Senku. But the question was, what would be the fastest route there? Taiju said the answer was simple, a straight line. And even Suika knows that. However, Chrome responded that it seemed too obvious and might be a trick question. Ryusui laughed, saying it was a good answer. The straight route follows the rum line. They would just choose a latitude and follow it straight across. That was the simplest way to go. This method had been used for navigation in the past. If they took this route, he explained, it would take them 70 days to reach the US. However, Senku said that was wrong. He declared it was time for the real correct answer. The shortest route, he explained, wasn't a straight line. The others were puzzled about how this could be. Taiju remarked that curving way up on top of the map looked like a big detour to him. But Senku replied that if they didn't trust him, they should look at the globe with his own eyes. They used a string to compare the two routes. When they placed them side by side, Senku's preferred route did look like a detour on the flat map, but in reality, it was shorter. It was really different when placed on a sphere. Kahaku simply commented, "I see," while Gin noted that this was similar to what airplanes do when flying across the globe. Again, Senku explained that the actual shortest way was the Great Circle sailing route. If they followed this shortcut, they would reach the US in just 40 days. The two argued again, as Ryusui insisted they should take the rum line route, which would take 70 days. But Senku remained firm that the Great Circle route would only take 40 days. Ryusui explained that Great Circle sailing demands constant bearing adjustments based on their current position. It would be the toughest route they could chart and would be difficult for their sailors. Senku countered that they had GPS on their ship of science. If they linked it with Ruri and the others in Japan, his way would be 10 billion% doable. Ryusui remained unconvinced. He argued that although they had some training, their sailors could still be considered amateurs. Moreover, he stated that armchair arguments wouldn't conquer the Pacific. He insisted it would take 70 days, explaining that as a man of the sea, he was just being realistic. He asked if that was wrong. Their discussion continued into the night. Senku explained they wouldn't make it in time for the yellow dent corn. If they could arrive in 40 days, they would slide right into autumn safely. The corn would be slightly over-ripened, but they would save time drying it. They would arrive just in time to make the alcohol needed for the revival fluid. However, after a leisurely 70-day trip, winter would catch up to them and they would be out of time. They would be stuck in the US, wasting an entire crucial year of their valuable time in their fight against Y-Man. Therefore, they needed to make it in 40 days. As a scientist, Senku said he was just being logical. He asked if there was anything wrong with that. Ryusui remained quiet while others discussed the matter. Chrome and Ukyo thought they both seemed right. They noted that Ryusui was looking out for them with a realistic approach, while Senku was being logical and thinking about the future. The situation was tough, and they found it difficult to decide who was more correct. Gin interjected, saying that if both were right, then they should consider him on Team Ryusui. He wasn't a fan of hard labor. Meanwhile, Kahaku sided with Senku. She preferred to reach their destination as soon as humanly possible. Gin commented that she always preferred the fast and furious approach. Ryusui thought for a moment before saying they would need to double everyone's rations. Senku smiled and said there was no problem with that. Francois added that if they did so, it would have their maximum possible sailing duration. Senku confidently replied that it was no big deal since they would arrive earlier. It would shave off 10 days. However, Ryusui insisted they couldn't go lower than that, and if Senku pushed further, he would need to stand up for their cruise rights, even if it meant opposing Senku. but he insisted again that their time limit was just 40 days. Ryusui became furious with their endless discussion. The two then stripped down to settle their disagreement through a fight, and both were game for it. Others on the ship became concerned as the situation seemed to worsen. A showdown was about to happen between Senku and Ryusui. Suddenly, a poker table appeared, while the two opponents put on suits. Poker chips and playing cards were brought out. Everyone present was shocked that they would face off in a game of poker. Senku commented, asking why Ryusui needed to obsess over fancy clothes. Ryusui just laughed and said this was their chance to show the audience that this was a formal affair. That way, they would be more inclined to follow the winner, which, he said, would obviously be him. It was because Gin would be dealing the cards. He greeted Senku and apologized, saying he needed to align himself with Team Ryusui this time. Senku couldn't believe it. He insisted that the quack mentalist was 10 billion% sure to cheat. Gin laughed and said his words were hurtful. Ryusui commented that anyone could join. Because of this, Kahaku sat beside Senku, saying they couldn't have lopsided teams. She thought it wouldn't be a problem if she joined Senku's side. He was pleased because Kahaku had a sharp eye for moving things. Therefore, he told her to watch Gin's sticky fingers carefully. The Perseus Luck Casino was on, marking the start of the battle between Senku and Kahaku versus Ryusui and Gin. Chrome commented that things seemed to be heating up. Nikki remarked that it was hard to tell who would win now. Meanwhile, Yo was extremely excited, saying it was time to gamble. While sailing, others were also excited to witness the poker showdown. Both teams sat down, while many observed from a distance. This was a battle between Ryusui and Gin versus Senku and Kahaku. Once again, Minami used the voice recorder to document this epic showdown between their ship captain and science captain to decide their route across the ocean. She explained that Ryusui preferred the longer but easier route, while Senku wanted the tougher but faster route. Even the audience was divided. Yo bet on Ryusui because Gin was on his side. He was certain that Gin's sneaky tricks couldn't be beaten. Suika didn't understand what betting meant, but she sided with Ryusui's team because he seemed better at games. Taiju responded that this was a battle of wits, and Senku had never lost at those. Ginro called them dummies for not realizing how good Kahaku's eyesight was. Minami commented that they were getting too excited, considering their lives were at stake. The game began, and Gin said oops as the game cards fell face up. He apologized for being careless. While he was shuffling, Kahaku watched his every move carefully. As he was dealing the cards, Kahaku suddenly stood up and grabbed his wrist. She said it was odd because, if what her eyes saw was correct, he seemed to have placed a specific card on top. Of course, she said she was willing to admit if she was wrong. In case the top card wasn't the Ace of Hearts. They flipped it to check, and Kahaku was right. It was indeed the Ace of Hearts. Gin played innocent, saying it was surprising that the card ended up there. According to him, it was just a coincidence. Gin's Bido Magic, Part 1 was then explained. First, one needs to identify the desired card, then spread out the pile. The card should be gently retrieved using fingers from underneath and moved wherever desired. However, this would require intense practice. Because of what happened, Kahaku declared that they couldn't let that smooth talker handle the cards anymore. Gin responded by saying she was being harsh. That night, the battle between the two groups continued steadily. One team laid down a 3 of a kind and showed a flush. Ryusui confidently raised the stakes, saying it was time to kick the battle up a notch. Senku laughed, thinking that Ryusui was always gutsy, which made it impossible to read whether he was bluffing or not. The spectators got excited because one moment it looked like one side would win, then it would switch in the next. Nevertheless, Suika noticed that Ryusui had more chips than Senku. Kahaku kept watching the opponent's moves. She quickly tapped Gin's hand and asked if he had sprinkled something on top of the deck. She caught it in her hand, and Senku noticed it was sugar. Gin defended himself, saying he wasn't handling the cards, just as he promised. So Kahaku announced a new rule. He wasn't allowed to move his hands at all. Part 2 of Gin's Bido Magic was then discussed. The first step was to sprinkle salt or sugar on top of the deck, and when a card was placed on top of it, it would slide differently, making it easier to identify. While the spectators were talking about the game, Senku noticed something when Gin placed his elbow on the table. Because of this, he understood what Gin intended to do with the sugar. He ordered Kahaku to check what was in Gin's sleeve, and she quickly grabbed his hand and lifted it. A bug came out from his sleeve. It was a beetle, and when it smelled something sweet, its feelers would react to the card marked with sugar. Kahaku was very annoyed and asked Gin how many more tricks he had. Gin denied having any more, saying that was all he had. If she didn't believe him, he suggested she check the deck. She could examine each card, one by one. They did this, and even the audience was watching. Senku realized that after the bug stunt, all eyes were focused on him and Kahaku, including those of the spectators who were watching the deck. Ryusui laughed and raised again. He pushed forward his stacked chips and went all in. Everyone was shocked at the amount. It seemed this would be the final hand. At that moment, Kahaku seemed to realize something too. While they were looking at the deck, Ryusui's cards in his hand had been flipped around. She accused Gin of switching the cards. But again, he played innocent. Senku explained that this was a basic principle of magic tricks. The scene-stealing bug caused everyone to look at the deck, preventing them from noticing what he would do. He added that those little tricks were somewhat sloppy and below Gin's level. Therefore, he wanted them to think they had seen everything so they would focus on the deck. He could have swapped Ryusui's 4 bottom cards. All of that was just set up for this big decisive move. Ukyo thought that if he had prepared those 4 cards all along, they were likely the strongest 4 possible. According to Nikki, Senku could only win with a straight flush, which was extremely improbable. Senku thought carefully and concentrated, which surprised the opposing team. Senku called Kahaku's attention and mentioned the 2nd and 5th from the top and 2nd from the bottom. Ukyo thought that now Senku had no choice but to fold. Instead, Senku pushed his chips forward, going all in as well. Everyone was surprised by this move. In Gin's mind, his actions had successfully captured everyone's attention, and that was indeed the basic principle of magic tricks. Kahaku quickly grabbed some cards and announced they would replace 3 cards in their hand. Her movements were extremely fast. Gin asked if she had really taken them from the top of the deck. She mimicked his earlier response, saying of course and expressing disbelief at his accusation. The spectators whispered among themselves. Tsukasa noted that Kahaku had taken the cards from the middle of the face-down deck. Chrome asked what difference that made. If she couldn't see the cards, then it shouldn't matter. Gin and Ryusui stared at the deck. Gin couldn't detect any special markings whatsoever. Ryusui was curious if this was just one big bluff. The 2 captains locked eyes, and Ryusui said how fun this was. Now that they were both all in, this would decide the entire game. The suspense was evident on the spectator's face, because now it was a showdown. Ryusui laid down his cards and declared 4 of a kind. However, when Senku laid down his hand, he announced a royal straight flush. Everyone was in disbelief. With this, he claimed all of his opponent's chips. Even Ukyo couldn't do anything despite him laying down 5 aces. Gin asked how Senku had done it, saying he couldn't figure out how the cards were marked. Senku replied that he really wouldn't know, because the scientific marking was colorless and invisible. He had used urushiol, soaked up from the lacquer that was conveniently lying around. From the beginning, he had been looking for those cards and had marked their edges using urushiol. Minami commented that the lacquer was indeed very convenient. Chrome had mentioned earlier about the voice recorder and how it carved sound into that lacquered wooden tube. Suika noted that the urushi stuff was see-through and invisible. She wondered how Senku knew which cards had it. Suddenly, Senku's face swelled up while he hugged the chips. Because of this, they realized that Senku's extremely sensitive skin had served as his sensor. As a result, Senku was declared the winner of the battle. Gin couldn't believe that Senku had risked his life for this. Consequently, they would take the Great Circle route across the Pacific Ocean. Though it was 10 billion% tougher, they would link up with Ruri and the others in Japan. They would also use GPS to navigate the globe. This shortcut, Senku declared, was courtesy of science. Despite his visibly swollen face from allergies, Senku was declared the winner. Ginro was overjoyed, claiming he had become rich, while Ukyo couldn't believe he had placed a bet. Yo was crying intensely, lamenting that this loss had depleted every last Drago he had. Nevertheless, he remained hopeful, saying he would recover everything next time. He suggested another round, though Kahaku disagreed with this idea. However, the ship captain Ryusui was very enthusiastic about the plan. The other girls there were quite shocked. And so, the Perseus Luck Casino was then revealed on the ship. Everyone was happy about this, especially Yo. While watching them, Senku was pleased, knowing this was something Ryusui had been hoping for. This, he said, was the rebirth of the casino. According to Ryusui, recreation was a key component in troop logistics. He explained that if they were to cut their travel time from 70 days to 40, they needed to improve the crew's lifestyle. That was the trade-off. 10 days could be cut off with more rations. Recreational facilities also reduced another 10 days. Now, he had a plan to remove the final 10-day chunk. Only 50 days remained in their voyage to the US. Now that food and entertainment had been sorted out, only drinks remained. They wondered what the new shop inside the casino would be. It turned out to be Bar Francois. Everyone was shocked to learn there would be booze on the ship. However, Suika mentioned that she wasn't allowed to drink alcohol yet. Francois clarified that the bar wasn't limited to alcoholic drinks. In fact, he explained that their focus would be on virgin cocktails. He planned to create personalized cocktails for each guest. Gin was surprised by this plan, saying it was too much for a tiny bar on a ship deck. But Ryusui remarked that going above and beyond was Francois' mantra. Senku told Francois to let him know if he needed anything. Chrome was excited and offered the science team's help. Francois was extremely grateful to them. Because of their offer, he wasn't shy about requesting gum syrup. The science team immediately went to the lab to make it. They said they would need wheat for this. They would wash the flour and massage it to get the starch to settle in the water below. The secret ingredient, they said, was a few drops of sulfurina. Gin couldn't believe that would go into their drinks. According to him, it wasn't fit for consumption. Senka just laughed and said that if they drank it directly, their teeth would dissolve. That's why they needed to boil it for a while. Kaseki realized that this science trick would neutralize it. He commented that Gin was always so impatient. The next step, Senku said, was to add toxic witherite. The other two couldn't believe he was going to add even more poison. Chrome thought it wasn't as bad as its name suggested. If they thought about it carefully, he said, it was obvious that Senku wouldn't use actual poison. However, Senku responded that it was indeed somewhat toxic. Their eyes widened as they asked why he would do that. Senku said he'd had enough of the peanut allergy. He explained that this was actually the process he used to make sugar and other things. They could use mirin too, he added, but it only produced a tiny amount. He explained that they just needed to mix it to bring the pH into harmless territory. That was the science behind it. He warned, however, that this shouldn't be tried at home as it could be lethal. Senku proudly showed off the rebirth of gum syrup. Chrome tasted it and was amazed at how sweet it was. Meanwhile, Suika was getting milk from a goat there. Taiji was puzzled when he saw them heating the milk. But the water was only lukewarm, like bathwater. That was the point, Chrome explained. When they poured it through a filter into a bottle, it suddenly turned into something like yogurt. To reach their goal, they only needed gum syrup, yogurt, and lemon. They would mix the strained yogurt and gum syrup, with lemon juice added last. As a result, Francois presented the lactic acid beverage that resembled Calpico. He prepared it at the bar and served it to Suika. He told her to enjoy it. She drank it using the provided straw and had mixed reactions about it. She said she had never tasted anything like it before. It was very sweet, but also had sourness to it. She couldn't stop drinking it because it was so delicious. Yuzuriha was delighted to see her apple Calpico. Meanwhile, Kaseki noticed the small decoration on the rim of her glass that looked exactly like Suika's helmet. He said it was super cute and made from cucumber. Francois responded that it wasn't just decoration. When the drink was half finished, he would put the helmet lookalike into the glass. Suika submerged the cucumber into her drink, and Suika couldn't explain the flavor bomb that resulted. Because of adding the cucumber, she said the drink now tasted like watermelon and was extremely refreshing. Yuzuriha was impressed that the taste changed from apple to watermelon. Senku explained that this might be because the fruit juice was mixed with something from the gourd family. Francois explained that her brilliantly shining smile, like the sun, had a kind of reaction with the helmet to produce sparkling charms. He said that this cocktail was made in the image of Sui-Ka, whom he called Master. This drink was Francois' two-side sunshine. It was made with 45 ml of Calpico, 30 ml of apple juice, and a bit of grated cucumber plus cucumber garnish. But Francois didn't stop there. He continued making drinks until nighttime. He found pomegranate, cinchona tree, and cinnamon, and used their fruits to make booze. Everyone was overjoyed about this. Yuzuriha mentioned that in movies and stuff, they would watch bartenders tossing these drinks around. Chrome thought there must be a scientific reason for mixing drinks in that way. Senko was curious about what that reason might be. Francois responded that there was no scientific reason for it. It was just a bit of flair to provide a treat for the customer's eyes along with their taste buds. Ryusui proudly stated that Francois never skimped on service. He then presented the grenadine and tonic cocktail, personalized for Tsukasa. It was made with 20 ml of grenadine syrup from pomegranate and 80 ml of tonic water. Francois explained that the red from the pomegranate transforms when bathed in that scientific blacklight. Just like the quietly burning fire in Tsukasa's heart, he said. When he shone the black light on the drink, it suddenly turned blue. Everyone was impressed as it was glowing and absolutely beautiful. Next, he showed the Piquant Cinderella, the cocktail made for Kahaku. It combined ginger ale, orange, pineapple, and lemon juice, and a dash of grated ginger. Yo asked if it was just juice without any alcohol. Senku explained that ginger ale comes from ginger, and when you boil it together with cinnamon, you get chai syrup. Spicy cola was the drink for Gin. It was a mixture of cola, chai syrup, a slice of lemon, and a pinch of chili pepper. Francois explained that its simple exterior concealed his dash of mature spice. When Gin tasted it, he found it spicy and declared it was cola for adults. Yo still couldn't believe there was no alcohol in it. Kahaku was impressed, saying that humanity was truly a force to be reckoned with. Just imagine, she said, they had made all those drinks using only natural ingredients. While watching from the side, Senko commented that everything existing in the world was a natural ingredient. Ukyo remarked that each cocktail was perfect for every guest on the ship. In fact, he said they were so perfect, like pieces falling right into place. He glanced at Gin as he said this. Thanks to their poker game earlier, the casino on the ship had become a roaring success, and the crew had gained another fringe benefit with this bar. It seemed to suggest that they could overcome this arduous journey, whether Ryusui or Senku had won. Ukyo felt they would have arrived at the same outcome. In other words, since the dispute between Ryusui and Senku began, it had become a cumulative effort to get everyone on board with the plan to speed up their voyage. Ukyo wondered if this could have all been orchestrated by a certain mentalist. But anyway, he said it was just a fun theory. Gin laughed and said it was nonsense and that he was overthinking things too much. Nevertheless, he admitted that he had given his absolute all, and then some, in the poker game. It might not have been as exciting otherwise. So, if nothing else, he said, losing was a bit frustrating. The 3-layer tea latte cocktail was presented, specially made for Senku. It was made with matcha whip, milk, hojicha, and gum syrup. Nikki was delighted by its 3 colors, saying it would have been perfect for social media posting. But Ukyo reminded her that social media no longer existed. Francois explained that the top layer was matcha whip, the middle was milk, and the bottom was hojicha syrup. He said it was arranged in stripes like those in booth net cafes. It represented the layered, cumulative nature of science. Senku asked why they shouldn't just mix it all up if everything was going to end up in his mouth anyway. Francois said he had anticipated that response. If Senko chose to mix it beautifully, he explained, then the layers of scientific achievement would combine into an ever so slightly sweet latte. With that, Bar Francois in the Pacific was now open for business. With 40 days left until they reached the US, Yo still couldn't believe there wasn't a single drop of alcohol until the end. He questioned how it could even be called a bar. Other crew members, including Ginro, agreed with Yo. The US was still so far away. They claimed they couldn't finish that cruise without alcohol. Ginro added that the trip would go faster with liquor. His brother couldn't believe his logic. Francois assured them not to worry, saying it just needed some time to mature. Ryusui declared that if they thought their ship's bar would be incomplete, then they didn't know Francois yet. The next day, Senku called Chrome and Kaseki to show them what he was doing. Chrome asked if that was wheat since it was dripping wet. Kaseki noticed that some even had buds. According to Senku, they would roast and dry it. The two couldn't believe that he had first wet it and now planned to dry it. Chrome asked what the goal was. Next, Kahaku was digging through it to select and remove unwanted bits. She then smashed it until it became dust. The next step was to dissolve it in hot water and filter it. After that process, you would get wort. Chrome and Kaseki's eyes widened when they heard this. They tasted it, and Kahaku noticed it was slightly sweet and bitter. Not bad, Chrome commented. Senku called it a feast fit for the almighty yeast fungus, which he said really loves this stuff. When Gin heard about wort and yeast, though he didn't know the details, he asked if it was what he thought it was. If they removed the wort and added Japanese hops carhaneso and boiled it, they would just leave the work to the great and powerful yeast. The stuff that sticks to fruit peels used for making bread. They would just leave it and let it ferment into alcohol. In the end, they would get carbonation. Multiple wooden barrels were shown there. Excitement was visible on Yo's face when Senku opened the tap of one barrel and its contents poured out. Finally, they had made beer. Ryusui said this would revitalize them all and made a toast. The crew celebrated and drank together. They even roasted food to eat. Yo got so drunk that he started rambling about all sorts of things. Minami realized that when he's drunk, he apparently likes to tell all kinds of stories. A drunken Ginro was offering alcohol to Matsukaza. He said he wanted to hear stories about how impressive he was when he was still Matsukaza's lord. But his brother clarified that he was not Matsukaza's master. Matsukaza thought about it and remembered. He said his lord had a strong heart until the end. He believed that humanity was not destined to fall to the wickedness of foul petrification weapons. The story then flashed back to show his master and his companions looking up at the sky. The air of their island was enveloped by numerous Petri beams. Did someone hear a voice along with the device as it rained down? Or perhaps the incantation needed to activate it was discovered through testing. Either way, it didn't take long before someone discovered how strange these weapons were. We then see a tribal leader using it against enemies. The law and order on that island would surely crumble if these fell into the hands of brigands. Therefore, Matsukaza's lord declared that every last one of these devices must be found and destroyed. However, he was hit by it on his hand, which Matsukaza immediately cut off to prevent it from spreading to his whole body. While lying on the ground at the top of the hill, he told Matsukaza that he wouldn't last much longer there. Matsukaza refused to hear what he called nonsense. His lord said he had thought about the events, about why the heavens had rained down these weapons upon people. At first, he thought it was divine punishment, but wasn't that strange, he asked. If the heavens wanted to petrify them all, then why not just send a single device capable of enveloping the entire island? Matsukaza couldn't answer this. Another question he posed was why these weapons were so simple for humans to use. He said it seemed designed to bait everyone into willingly petrifying each other. He was furious and wished to prove the heavens wrong. He wanted to show that humans weren't that foolish and that they couldn't be mocked. Matsukaza's vision darkened when he heard these words and saw numerous enemies approaching with weapons in hand. Because of that, blood spilled as he single-handedly slaughtered each one of them. Numerous petrification devices were thrown into the air. He paused only to think about where these were coming from. He said there was only one device left, but he couldn't escape the inevitable doom. So, he raised his hand to be petrified and said that he needed to tell future generations about the source of this evil. We then see him draw the image of the weapon on his arm that Senku and his friends saw in the future. His entire body finally turned to stone while standing. Back in the present, morning had come and Ginro thought about when he couldn't believe he really looked like Matsukaza's lord, even suggesting that Matsukaza should serve him instead. He felt ashamed because of Matsukaza's story. However, Matsukaza said he knew he had failed to protect his lord, and that bitterness in his heart wouldn't go away even if he took revenge on Y-Man. Nevertheless, he said he would still try. Everyone around him was quiet, and Francois handed something to him. Francois presented matcha beer to comfort him, a blend of beer and matcha powder. He explained that these two layers of bitterness, born from maturity, were elevated to a smooth, sublime flavor. He hoped Matsukaze would enjoy it. Matsukaze stared at it for a moment before taking a drink, and even after just one sip, he suddenly collapsed to the ground. Everyone was shocked to discover he was such a lightweight. That evening, he shouted when he woke up. He had seen Tsukasa, Kahaku, and Kinro doing weapons training. Remembering his desire to become stronger, he wanted to spar with Tsukasa. He bowed and apologized. He said he had forgotten his place. Tsukasa responded that was fine. He was thinking he needed to train as well. Suika was delighted to notice that Matsukaze had woken up. Chrome was holding a petrified figure on the ship and asked if they were really going to revive that man. Senku just laughed and explained that with Tsukasa revived and a gun on hand, this person wouldn't be able to do much damage. Besides, with humanity's fate hanging in the balance, he wasn't foolish enough to argue about unimportant things. He said Tsukasa was in charge of combat, and if he said he needed him, then Senku would give it to him. Yes, Tsukasa replied. His specialty was hand-to-hand combat. For weapons training, that person was the most suitable instructor. Senku then poured revival fluid on the one they were referring to, and before long, he returned to normal. It turned out to be Yoga. Immediately upon waking, Tsukasa told him that he would need his strength. If he could train Matsukaze in the polished ways of weaponry from their time, he would surely grow exponentially. When Yoga opened his eyes, he said he had just one condition, which surprised everyone. Senku laughed and thought he would ask for pardon for the people he killed, including Tsukasa. He said they could discuss that after they dealt with Y-Man, but Yoga replied that wasn't necessary. The justice system they implemented in this world wouldn't accept that anyway. The condition he wanted them to grant him was the right to revive 2 people of his choosing. Senku just smiled while Chrome was curious about who he meant. It turned out to be Hamura and Maz. Now that the 2 were revived, weapons training on the ship began. However, Ginro was just watching from a distance. He whispered to his brother Kinro, saying he didn't want to be part of that training. He refused to be included in that pack of dangerous dudes. So, he suggested something to his brother. That night, the brothers trained separately. Ginro asked if he knew that, like bitterness, when you mix in a layer of uselessness, it becomes a smooth flavor or something. Kinro couldn't understand what he was talking about. He clarified that it was just something Francois had said. The scene shifted to show that during the early Middle Ages, the Vikings were said to be the fiercest warriors who ruled the northern seas. Senku, Ryusui, and others were aboard the ship. Minami asked what the skit was about. Ukyo explained that they were demonstrating maritime navigation. Due to their shockingly advanced navigational skills, the Vikings reached North America 500 years before Columbus. Ukyo was impressed by this. He was curious about how they managed to do it back then. Ginro thought the Vikings must have cheated. He wondered how they could sail so fast as if there were signs guiding them. Kinro replied that the sun was the only guidepost at sea. However, Kahaku pointed out that sunny skies weren't guaranteed. Suika added that it was quite mysterious. It seemed the Vikings knew where the sun was even on cloudy days. From the ship, Kahaku noticed something and said that the Viking over there appeared to be doing something amazing. She was referring to Senku, who was on the other boat. She wasn't sure why, but she had a feeling he had created a crazily creative tool, something that seemed magical. Indeed, the Vikings used magical items. One of these was a stone that revealed the sun's position at all times, the Sunstone. However, the legends only make it sound like magic. Ryusui added that figuring out one's position on the open sea was extremely difficult back then. Ginro couldn't believe how hard it was, and yet they were saying they would take the toughest route of all. Senku laughed and said it wouldn't be a problem for them. Thanks to science and Professor GPS, he said they would know their location at all times. Gin said that made sense in theory, but wondered how GPS would work in that stone world. Senku smiled and responded about coordinating with Japan. Speaking of which, Ruri and the gang will be sending their regularly scheduled message any minute now, Ukyo responded. In Japan, they could be seen making sundials and hourglasses. Mirai was impressed by the numerous hourglasses there. Ruri explained that using the sundial and hourglasses, they would be able to give the crew on the ship an accurate reading of the time in Japan. The crew on the ship got excited when they realized Ruri would be sending a message, thinking it might be her true feelings for someone, sent across the sea. Chrome had no clue what they were talking about. Senku clarified that they were too far away for a full-blown conversation. Right then, the bell rang. Ukyo mentioned that the time report barely reached them through the shortwave signal. Once they knew the time, Senku would start counting to keep it accurate to the second. Gin almost forgot that Senku was their human clock. Suika was curious about how knowing the time would help them determine their location. She said she didn't understand any of it. However, Gin told her not to worry because she was in the same boat as him and the other grown-up modern timers. Kaseki used the sextant and said that the sun was at its zenith. Chrome added that it was noon where they were currently located. Ryusui explained that the time difference with Japan would give them their longitude, while the sun's position would provide their latitude. Doing this manually was basically man-powered GPS. Although Taiju couldn't understand the technical details, he grasped the last part. If they could determine the longitude and latitude, then they would know their exact location. Only 30 days remained before they could reach the US. Suika thought their science journey was cool. Chrome called it bad stuff. As a scientist himself, he said he needed to pull his own weight there. Just seeing the sun would tell them everything they needed to know. Senku remarked that as long as the weather remained good, it would be smooth sailing to the US. However, the weather suddenly darkened, which no one had expected. They became annoyed that Senka had to say that. It was as if when he was born, he had assigned full stats to intelligence, willpower, and effort but 0 to luck. Kaseki was troubled because the sun wasn't shining due to this mess. For now, he said they would have to rely on Ryusui's captain's intuition. Senku added that if this storm continued, they would likely face major time loss. Without the sun, their boat was essentially lost at sea. This prompted Suika to mention that she wished they had the sunstone from the Viking stories. When Chrome heard this, he suddenly had an idea and ran quickly. He opened a jar at the side of the lab and rummaged through it. He showed them a stone and explained that he had obtained it from Skarn, a treasure trove of naturally formed minerals. Actually, he said he had never seen this stone before. He asked Kahaku if she could carve it down to a perfect prism using her gorilla power. She was willing to help him because she thought there was a pretty jewel inside it. Kahaku was happy to help as long as he would send it to Ruri. After she hammered the stone, it sparkled and took shape. Kahaku admired it, but to her, it just looked like a whitish rock. Chrome said he thought the same thing before. However, it was transparent, and when looking through it, one would see double, but slightly split off from each other. Kahaku thought that might be what made it interesting, though she wasn't sure if Ruri would like it. Chrome couldn't believe that's what they were discussing. While he was searching before, he always thought that somewhat interesting things might become significant at some point, so he needed to examine everything carefully. According to Chrome, that's how a scientist lives. As they continued sailing, Chrome came out holding his stone and showed that he had made 2 marks on the other side. He thought the sun might be there. Suika commented that it was so cloudy they couldn't see any light at all. That's right, but it doesn't matter anymore, Chrome said. They just needed to point it where the sun might be and adjust the angle. Soon, the 2 marks he made were showing the same brightness, though he wasn't sure how that happened. Kahaku asked if that meant he had found the sun in the dark sky. He smiled and confirmed that was correct. Wherever that stone pointed, that's where the sun was. It didn't matter whether they could see it or not. Finally, they had acquired a sunstone. Both Kahaku and Suika were delighted about this. Senku recognized the stone as calcite. That natural prism split light rays into 2. Gin held it and asked if when it shone equally bright, it meant they could determine the sun's direction. Generally speaking, yes, Senku replied. Ryusui mentioned that he had heard about calcite before. Investigations of sunken Viking ships had revealed a surprising amount of calcite. He wondered why the Vikings needed to carry so much of it, saying it always seemed like a mystery. While they couldn't be certain, Ukyo believed it wasn't mere magic or legend. The Vikings really did use the sunstone. Ryusui laughed and declared that 4,000 years later, just like the Vikings did before them, they would chart their course to North America using the same unshakable power of science. Senku looked proudly at Chrome while he remembered the first time they had worked together and how far he had come since then. Despite the bad weather, the Perseus continued sailing. The captain, Ryusui, remained unbothered as he busied himself at the steering wheel. Though the ocean waves were large, they pressed forward undaunted. Several nights passed while those in Japan continued sending messages. Thanks to their sunstone, they could still determine the sun's location. While sailing, Suika spotted something and pointed it out to her companions, an enormous iceberg. The crew members' eyes widened when they saw it. Besides that, they also encountered a pod of massive whales. Everyone was amazed by this sight. Meanwhile, Ryusui and Senku remained focused on their work. Eventually, when Hamura climbed to the top of the ship and used their telescope, she finally spotted land. Everyone rejoiced because this meant they had reached the American continent. They all celebrated their successful journey. They finally reached North America, specifically San Francisco. Ginro was in tears, saying they had waited so long for this moment. Everyone was crying with joy because after weeks of sailing, they would finally set foot on land again and eat meat. Ukyo laughed, noting that they couldn't eat too much meat during their long sea voyage. Tsukasa added that due to their training, the battle team really craved animal-based protein. Taiju suggested they could hunt wild animals on dry land. He was curious about what kinds of beasts lived on that continent. He didn't know because this was his first time vacationing overseas. He never expected his first time outside Japan would be like this. Minami was surprised that Taiju called it a vacation. Senku responded that such jokes were part of that pea-brain's charm. They were suddenly startled when they noticed something past the fog. They could clearly see the bodies of petrified people trapped in the cliff. Senku became sad upon seeing this, and Gin broke into a sweat saying they already knew about this. However, since this was their first venture outside Japan, they had no way of knowing what really happened to the whole world. There was still a chance that fake Lillian's story was true, that while Japan was petrified, the rest of the world was revived. Or perhaps other countries had defeated the Petri beam from the start. In everyone's hearts, they still held onto hope, no matter how small. Nevertheless, it was clear that even this part had been affected. Everyone's faces were filled with sadness. Meanwhile, Kahaku noticed a group of statues clustered at the cape. Her companions realized she was right. Senku thought it was a series of piled-up car crashes. Ukyo added that the cars might have corroded over time, leaving only the petrified drivers behind. Kyo suddenly wondered why the cars are down in the water. Ryusui responded that there might have been many cars there before. He said he had passed by there in his own boat a few thousand years back. He explained that it was once the mark of the gateway to the Pacific. It cut through the San Francisco fog with its red brilliance. He was referring to the Golden Gate Bridge. Yuzuriha realized he was right, but now it was gone, along with everything else humanity had built. Other crew members commented that deep down, they thought this would be their last chance to find help. Taiju cheered them up, telling them not to look at it that way. He said that once they found corn and managed to grow and multiply it, they could revive everyone in the world using the power of science. Senka smiled and agreed. He was confident they would save all 7.8 billion members of humanity. They continued sailing, and the ship captain announced that this was the Sacramento River. Here, they would split into a resource replenishment team and a corn search team. Tsukasa said that the fighters would protect the corn search team from dangerous wildlife. The two groups separated, and Chrome declared they would search that land until their feet hurt, just to find that corn. Gen replied that it would be difficult since the US was so vast. Senku looked at the map and said that while they were always taking a gamble on finding any corn, there was one spot that could be where they'd find the corn belt they were looking for. Since they had arrived on the West Coast, it might be in Northern California. They would enter San Francisco Bay, then follow the Sacramento River to what used to be Sacramento. Gin was overwhelmed by this information and asked him to slow down his explanation since they didn't have encyclopedic knowledge of American geography. After a while, they realized he simply meant that if they followed that river, they would find the corn. They asked why he hadn't just said that in the first place. Senku replied that Chrome was always ready to dive in and adapt, making him the ideal search team leader. Ukyo mentioned that the time when the corn would wither was approaching, making him wonder if they would arrive on time. Senku said that was indeed the issue. However, the Earth was experiencing what's called precession. It was like a toy top that starts to tilt while spinning. Since the planet's rotational axis had tilted slightly over 3,700 years, it had affected Earth's climate, which would help them. The seasons would change 9 days from that day. They were pleased because this meant an extended deadline. Nevertheless, Senku added that the downside was that climate change would affect the ecosystem in weird ways. He just hoped no beast would attack them. Tsukasa seriously responded that they would actually welcome a beast attack, and Kahaku agreed. Ginro was shocked to hear this. When Gin peeked through the porthole, his eyes widened at something strange in the water. "Speak of the devil," he said. As always, he should have realized this. It wasn't merely that Senku had bad luck, but rather no luck at all. He used his scientific mind to create worst-case scenarios, and as soon as he mentioned them, they happened. Enormous alligators emerged and attacked their vehicle. However, the group's fighters led by Tsukasa came to the rescue. Their motorboat appeared, and they were ready to protect the science team. The gators thought they were meat, but the ship crew members thought the same about them. Ginro trembled when he realized that's what they meant by welcoming an attack. The alligators shook in fear because of them, and Tsukasa expressed gratitude for the circle of life. Senku and Gin were visibly weakened by the current situation. Nevertheless, their mightiest all-star lineup came to the rescue. They took their stance and brought out their weapons to slay the attackers. Because of this, their group landed on the shore and cooked and sang together. Now that they had set foot on American soil, Ryusui said there was one thing they needed to eat. He was referring to burgers. Francois was busy grilling burger patties there. He made a gator burger with quadruple patties. Everyone was excited over those hamburgers. While Tsukasa was chopping meat, he called Senku. He showed him something that an alligator had swallowed whole. Senku was concerned when he saw it, and when they opened it, he took out the contents and lifted them up. He was surprised because it was an ear of corn, and specifically the special American variety they were looking for. He was overjoyed that they had made it before the cutoff. The seeds to revive all of humanity might be upriver. Therefore, their first destination would be the Corn City. Chrome was overjoyed because they finally found the life-giving corn. According to Senku, it was the cheat code corn that the US was proud of. Gin was then curious about why it was called cheat code corn. Senku answered that it was the Great Yellow Dent. He explained that while it wasn't delicious, one could extract a crazy amount of alcohol from it. Taiju was very excited about this, saying they could now proceed with reviving the whole world. "Hang in there," he said to the statues there. He added that it wouldn't be long before they could return them to their original state. However, they weren't yet sure how much corn remained. Taiju remained positive, saying that even if there was only a little, they would definitely be able to multiply it. "Now, this is a race against time," Ryusui responded. While on the motorboat, something caught Kahaku's gaze, so she quickly moved to catch it from the water while holding onto Yoga's hair. Using chopsticks, she managed to catch some corn kernels. She mentioned that they were floating downstream. Ukyo thought they would find corn growing upriver. Chrome added that there might be a considerable amount there. Senku pondered, noting how convenient it was that these kernels were just bobbing along down the river. They called the people on Perseus to inform them that they had found corn by the river. Yuzuriha's companions were overjoyed. "It's not the source though," Senku said. For now, he explained that they needed more data. Gin told them to let him know if they found any downstream from their current location. And so, everyone celebrated this success. Their cheers were so loud they could be heard from far away. On the other side, wild beasts could be seen in the middle of the forest, looking up at a tall tree. The search team's announcement about finding corn in the river could be heard from there. Suddenly, something fell from the tree, a strange creature with glowing eyes. The wolf-like creatures growled at its presence and soon attacked it. However, the group was defeated. That night, Gin noticed they had just set up camp when Senku immediately covered their light with a white cloth. When Taiju asked if bright night lights didn't attract bugs, Senku replied that was exactly the goal. He explained that by observing what kinds of bugs were attracted to that light stimulus, they could learn more about the area. He had a suspicion. A butterfly-like creature was seen approaching the light, attracted to it. Senku identified it as the European corn borer moth, which primarily subsists on corn. This meant there was a lot of corn nearby. Kahaku admired it, thinking it was a butterfly, but Gin corrected her, saying it was a moth. Ukyo added that it was mostly a semantic distinction to start with. The light lure was eerily beautiful. Senku pondered and suddenly asked Kahaku and the villagers if they had ever seen this kind of moth before. Kahaku answered that she never had. Anyway, she admitted she didn't really pay much attention to different types of moths. Senku shared that these moths were fond of grains, so when humanity went extinct, one would expect the moth population to be affected. But he pointed out how many moths had gathered there in such a short time. There were so many, enough to make one think someone out there was growing a cornfield. Taiju laughed and asked why Senku looked so gloomy. He was very positive because it was good news that they had found the cornfield. This meant they could revive many people. Senku didn't answer and seemed to have noticed something. Tsukasa was also restless. He said he was sensing something. There was something at the top of the tree with glowing eyes. Tsukasa mentioned he could sense bloodlust. Kahaku was curious if he meant a wild beast. But Genro said that since the ultimate battle squad was there, they shouldn't be afraid. Kinro couldn't believe he said that while hiding behind him. Matsukaza mentioned that he was familiar with this sort of ki. But for Tsukasa, there was no such thing as ki. He thought that smell came from the breakdown of adrenaline. However, he wasn't sure yet. He thought carefully, knowing his role was to protect them all. He asked about the faint scent they were smelling in the air. He wondered if it was smoke from a fired gun. Meanwhile, Yoga recalled what Kahaku mentioned earlier about corn floating downstream, and how Senku found it suspiciously convenient that it just came down the river. With his eyes closed, he said that the enemy was clever. He thought they had been lured. Tsukasa shouted, suddenly ordering them back to the boat to take cover. Bullets suddenly rained down, causing the crew members to rush back to their boat. The gunfire followed them even into the water. Senku couldn't believe what was happening, and he used the lab door as a shield. Others hid behind it while the enemy continued firing. Ukyo identified it as a machine gun, and Genro asked what it was. A black figure could be seen responsible for the rain of bullets on them. However, Ryusui said not to underestimate a captain at his helm. He shouted water bulwark as they made their escape. The enemy stopped firing, wondering how they knew. The shooter could be seen with a scar, suggesting he might have been revived like them. Back on the boat, they thanked Tsukasa for his quick reflexes. Because of him, no one was harmed. Meanwhile, Gin had many questions about that machine gun, who fired it, why, and how they obtained it. It made him wonder if the United States had actually survived. Yo had thought there was no one there. Then there would be no explanation for what we saw if that were the case. Ryusui responded. Ukyo suggested that the person might have been revived on their own, just like Senku. Everyone was shocked by this theory. Ryusui said that person might be the one growing the corn. If that's true, Senku said, then they should be grateful. But worst case, he added, they were looking at a showdown against an evil scientist. Too bad for them, he declared, because that's an arena where he can never lose. The next day, while continuing their journey, Taiju couldn't believe there was someone like Senku on the other side of the world. Someone who also revived themselves. Senku responded that he hadn't patented it. Besides, he added, scientific knowledge was free for everyone in the world. Anyone could learn if they wanted to. Gin wondered if that person also started from square one like Senku, from a dinky stone axe all the way to machine guns. He knew it's not that simple for just anyone. That's just conjecture or a conclusion based on incomplete info, Ukyo remarked. What they knew for now was that this was a scientist who managed to revive on their own. Senku added that this person's science was more advanced than theirs, at least when it came to weaponry. Additionally, according to Ryusui, there was one irrefutable fact. This person was eager to kill them. Everyone became worried when they suddenly heard an engine sound from behind them. Kinro said they were being followed. But Kahaku disagreed since she had been keeping watch. With her sharp eyesight, she hadn't spotted anything yet. There was no sign of another boat. Plus, they had traveled far since nighttime. It would be impossible for anyone to catch up to them that quickly. Ukyo looked up and couldn't believe where that sound was coming from. They all looked up. Yo was shocked at what he saw, and even Senku was surprised. The sound had come from above. There was a plane flying in the sky. Senku couldn't help but stare at it. As it descended, his companions called out to him. Taiju asked what they should do next. Should they greet it and make contact? Gin thought their best option for now was to wave a white flag. That was their only chance to discuss things and make friends. However, Kahaku wouldn't agree to that, since the enemy had tried to shoot them on sight. Unfortunately, that aircraft wouldn't descend unless it plans to attack, Ukyo said. The ship captain ordered everyone to hold onto something because they were leaving. They went full speed ahead in their escape. Although they moved quickly, the plane still caught up with them. The person in the plane was even smoking before readying his machine gun. He once again fired at Senka's group. Because of this, Senka's companions were thrown out of the boat. Ginro was concerned for Matsukaza, as he was grazed by a bullet in the shoulder. Matsukaza told him not to worry, saying it was just a scratch. Ginro pleaded with him for protection, but Kinro pointed out that he wasn't even hurt. Yo tried to shoot at the enemy, but Yoga told him it wouldn't hit, so he should stop wasting ammo. Yo responded by asking what choice they had, as they had nowhere else to run. The plane kept circling in the sky. It even positioned itself in front of the sun. Gin said it would keep coming back until they were sleeping with the fish. In the midst of chaos, Senku remained laser-focused on thinking of possible solutions. He took some water and mixed something into it. He explained that calcium carbide was used as fuel for gas welding. He laughed, saying he wasn't sure when this would come in handy, but he believed this was the perfect time to use it. He threw the bottle to Karisame, saying she had a strong throwing arm. He told her to put it to good use. Ginro was curious about what was in that bottle. Chrome admitted he didn't know either, but said they would find out later. For now, he said they should just trust Senku and Karisame. When Ginro asked him what he was making, Chrome answered that it was a rope with a hoop. They might need it. Just then, Karisame shouted that she needed stable footing and rope, so Chrome threw what he was holding. The enemy aimed his gun at them. Taiju, Kinro, and Kahaku supported as Karisame swung the bottle around. When she threw the bottle in the air, the person in the plane became concerned. Their bottle shattered against the plane, causing its engine to fail. As a result, the plane crashed. However, instead of worrying, the pilot was amused that they managed to destroy the engine with just a little move. He smiled and said, "Not bad at all." Senka's group was overjoyed at their success. As the plane was falling, its pilot emerged before it slid into a tree. He had a strange appearance with a mask on his face. He was talking to someone who explained that it was acetylene gas. While harmless to humans, it could stall an engine with just a 1% concentration. The person was impressed, saying it was an elegant way to bring down an aircraft. The shooter asked if this was one of those pyro-whatever weapons, saying he thought he had learned about it. The person on the other line responded that he was correct, pyrophoric. The shooter then explained that he had memory lapses because he was petrified for thousands of years. The man explained that this compound could be made from a simple mixture of water and calcium carbide. Calcium carbide could be obtained by burning charcoal and seashells. The shooter took a drag from his cigarette and simply replied that he understood now and it was a good lesson. Finally, the yet unnamed attacker's face was revealed. Now they knew that their opponents were sharp-witted science pros like the person he was talking to. Back with Senku, Ginro asked what if the enemy returned again with friends. He said they needed to escape right away. Ryusui couldn't believe his suggestion about escaping. "What are you saying?" Senku asked. They would do the exact opposite. Others were curious about the strange expressions on both their faces. Kahaku mentioned they made those faces when they agreed on something, and it was surely bound to be over something bad. As planned by the captains, they searched for the plane's crash site. Before the enemy could call for backup, they would find him. When they found the crashed aircraft, Kahaku climbed up to check its contents. However, it was empty. She wondered if the enemy had escaped. She was disappointed because they could have interrogated him for information. Meanwhile, Senku was smiling because the enemy had left something behind. Because of this, Ryusui said, "Finders keepers." Gin could only comment of course to this. Taiju used all his strength to cut down that tree with an axe where the plane had crashed. Soon after, they floated it on the water with the plane on top. They tied the wood and attached it to their boat to tow it. Senku declared that the righteous kingdom of science gladly accepted their gift. They would just need to refurbish it to become a plane that would fight for good. Ryusui agreed with this. They would chip away at the enemy's firepower and use it, Ryusui added, calling it a fantastic strategy. Because of this, their companions realized that the two only wanted the airplane all along. They should have known, because when Senka spotted the plane, his face showed how overjoyed his heart was, as if saying get excited. Senku admitted this. At last, they had acquired an aircraft this time, although it was busted. Kahaku noticed something interesting. She mentioned seeing something extremely interesting that was stuck to the enemy airplane's leg. When they examined it, Tsukasa identified them as corn leaves and kernels. Ukyo said this made sense. He explained that if the enemy was approaching them by aircraft, there must be a landing strip nearby. Therefore, there must be an open field that's leveled nice and flat for that purpose. Remembering what Senka had said, Taiju realized that the cornfield could be their landing strip. Tsukasa mentioned that standard practice would be to make a tactical retreat immediately after a sneak attack. While the alternative involved risks, he noted that choosing to pursue also had big advantages. When Gen asked who they would pursue, Senka responded that it was obviously their new friend, the pilot of that plane. He added that finding a whole cornfield would be a lucky find, as it would save them years of cultivation and propagation. He reminded them not to forget that the reason they came there was for corn. However, what Gen actually meant to ask was who would do the pursuing. The answer to that was himself, Chrome, and Kahaku. Gen started tearing up because he sensed it already, but still asked anyway. In contrast, Chrome was very excited. He explained that he was the group's explorer, Gen was the mentalist, and Kahaku, he was about to say gorilla but quickly corrected himself, was their bodyguard with hypervision. He declared they were the ultimate trio for tracking someone. Kahaku added that the enemy would be more likely to notice them if their group was larger. While walking, Gen mentioned that spotting the enemy's footprints was easy. Chrome then praised Gen. Gen walked ahead, thinking to himself whether they even needed a mentalist there. He thought that tracking job was too simple. His eyes suddenly widened, and the other two were surprised when he stopped. He said something was off there. Gen knew the enemy was luring them inside. The enemy knew exactly what they were doing. Gen became irritated and insulted because they were trying to challenge a mentalist of his caliber. He remembered what he said earlier about giving his all. That's why he was somewhat frustrated about his loss earlier. He said he couldn't take 2 losses in a row since he has to do some growing on his own. So, he called Chrome and Kahaku's attention, saying he would make sure to mark the path forward using flowers. He told them to stay behind and let him take the lead. They agreed to his plan, and Gen went ahead, leaving marks for them to follow. After a while, he raised a flag and spoke in English to ask if anyone was there. He was startled when someone suddenly appeared before him with gleaming eyes. It turned out to be the pilot from the plane earlier, holding a machine gun. Gen asked who he was, saying he hadn't noticed there was someone up there. When the pilot searched him, he pleaded not to point the weapon at him. He promised he wasn't carrying any kind of weapon. The enemy was smoking and said that even though Gen had no weapon, he must have other stuff up his sleeves. So, he asked who Gen was. Gen became serious before revealing the flowers in his hand. Because of this, the enemy figured out he was a magician. The enemy said he knew Gen only had strong hands and nothing else, based on when he searched him. At the very least, he said, Gen wasn't a warrior, unlike his skilled samurai friends. Gen listened quietly when the enemy said the first to strike wins. He said he wanted to crush all of them, but for now, he had many questions. He was sure Gen had questions too. So, he suggested that Gen come along to meet their leader. Gen quietly followed while observing his surroundings. In his mind, this could be the enemy's base. A vast plain could be seen beside the water. Gen was pleased that everything they were looking for was there. Senku was right about the cornfields. Besides that, there was also what appeared to be their castle-like headquarters. They were indeed cultivating a cornfield and had animals there too. While walking, Gen also noticed the landing strip. The man removed his armor and mask. Gen was very impressed when he saw what looked like their factory. Meanwhile, the plane pilot expected Zeno to be there. He told him to prepare to celebrate the first ever visitor of the new world. Zeno looked at Gen, and in Gen's mind, he was just like Senku but as an adult. Like them, he had a mark on his face, indicating that he too had been petrified. Suddenly, Gin's foot was submerged in a bucket. He was very startled and asked if it was some strange chemical. The one who led him there told him to relax, saying it was just salt water. Besides his right foot, his hands were also soaked, which puzzled Gin. Zeno said he was delighted to meet him. He explained that the man who had a habit of inhaling toxic fumes into his lungs was Stanley Snyder, an ex-military, but still military now working for him. Stanley clarified that he was just smoking. Zeno suddenly placed his arm at Gin's neck and introduced himself as Dr. Zeno. He asked who Gin was and where he came from. Gin couldn't believe that Zeno just casually touched his neck, thinking about personal space. He introduced himself as Gin Asagiri. He said he was formerly a magician in Japan. In Gin's mind, this wasn't a lie, but he thought he shouldn't mention anything about being a mentalist. The doctor was shocked to hear that he was from Japan. He was impressed that their group was brave enough to travel so far like an Eastern-bearing Columbus. Gin was sweating and noticed that Zeno was staring at something on the side. There were markers for breathing, sweating, and EKG reading. Because of this, it could be a polygraph test or something similar. Instead of getting nervous, Gin became excited because they were challenging a mentalist like him. He cried and said their work in the kingdom of science was intense. Furthermore, their science leader was the worst of all, a real taskmaster. That's why he left there. Zeno looked at the readings and observed. Stanley was impressed that Gin was unrattled. There was no hesitation in his answers, and he was curious if Gin was telling the truth. "Wasn't that good news?" he asked. "Not quite," said the doctor. He could either be honest to a fault or be considered the world's greatest liar. However, that wasn't a problem because he liked both types. In Gin's mind, he planned to infiltrate that place until they could acquire it, including the resources they needed to make a massive amount of revival fluid. He knew they needed to gain control of their cornfields. Stanley asked if he was saying they just needed to snuff out their science pro leader he mentioned. Gin was surprised, and when the doctor asked for the scientist's name, Gin knew he couldn't tell the truth. He thought that Senku wouldn't be able to fight, so he needed to find someone sturdy and willing to volunteer to fight for Senku. Therefore, he said the genius scientist's name was Dr. Taiju. Meanwhile, with Senku's group, Taiju suddenly sneezed out of nowhere when Gin mentioned his name. From a distance, Kahaku was keeping watch. She was curious about what that extremely tall tower was. Chrome said it was something bad, and they might have built it using science. They needed to gather more information about the enemy to report back to Senku. Using an improvised telescope, he searched for Gin. He asked Kahaku if she thought Gin had managed to infiltrate the place. Kahaku was confident that the smooth talker would find the right words to survive. She said he was the world's most trustworthy liar. Chrome was confused about how to trust a liar. He said you couldn't just combine those words like that. While up in the tree, he called the Perseus. Chrome said there was a change in plans. Senku understood, so he told Chrome not to speak further. Chrome hadn't expected that, but Yuzuriha understood that since they were using radio waves, the enemy scientist might intercept their signal. Ukyo said that might be why the enemy was aware of their plans. Because of this, Ryusui assumed the enemies knew Japanese. Tsukasa said to respond as briefly as possible and asked for a report about the situation and who was there. Chrome replied that it was him and the woman, as he couldn't say Kahaku's name. Just the two of them. Because of what Chrome said, they thought Gin might have been captured or had infiltrated the place by pretending to betray them. Ryusui thought it was option B, and Senku was absolutely certain of it too. Everyone was shocked when Senku suddenly turned off their communication device. He explained that if they left it on too long, the enemy could pinpoint the signal's origin. Ukyo agreed. Furthermore, they didn't know how advanced the enemy's tech was. In almost all their previous battles, science had been their advantage. However, in the current situation, it seemed they were at a disadvantage in the science department against the enemy. Senku thought this science user throwdown was a reason to get excited. The phone rang again, and this time Magma answered. He spoke suddenly and asked Chrome what the big idea was. He said Chrome shouldn't have called back. However, it was actually Dr. Zeno, greeting them. He said that must be their preferred frequency for communication. Everyone on the Perseus was shocked, while Senku became serious. Ukyo couldn't believe the enemy had contacted them. Others were nervous, but Magma just replied that he must be the big bad guy. Zeno apologized for his poor Japanese language skills, but he said that conversation wasn't suited for troglodytes, so he requested to speak with their science team leader. Magma was offended by what he said. Zeno said he wanted to speak with Dr. Taiju. Everyone was shocked to hear that name, especially Taiju himself. Senku figured out that this must have been Gen's doing. Even Ryusui understood that Gen did this to protect their actual science user by using their tough guy as a decoy leader. Taiju couldn't believe it. Nevertheless, he was willing to stand in for Senku. He changed his appearance and put on a lab coat, which prompted Minami to ask if a costume was really necessary for just a phone call. The ship captain said it was needed. Taiju answered and said he was Dr. Taiju. He told Zeno to pay attention because he had something to say. He said that shooting people with a machine gun without warning wasn't nice. Everyone was shocked by his response. Meanwhile, Zeno apologized to him. He explained that his soldier Stanley thought that was the best greeting to demonstrate the chasm that lies between their respective levels of science. We then see their various types of weapons and told the person he called Dr. Taiju that, as a fellow science pro himself, he should realize they already had a Haberbosch plant. Taiju couldn't believe this and admitted their Hyber thingy was impressive. Senku whispered to him not to say anything unnecessary, or else they would be found out. Minami was curious about what Dr. Zeno was referring to, and Senku clarified that it was a factory that produces ammonia. In short, using just water and air, they could produce unlimited gunpowder and ammunition. Because of that plant, they could produce ammo without any difficulty. Taiju asked if what Zeno was saying meant they could use their machine gun all day long. Zeno replied that he got the gist of it. The people on the ship were impressed by Taiju's acting. He seemed to really know what he was talking about. They couldn't believe he was such a performer. Dr. Zeno added that they were a collective of professional adults, unlike their ragtag band of merry youths just playing with science. Therefore, he hoped they would surrender and serve him. Nothing more, nothing less. He admitted that their population was lacking. They hadn't expected him to say this. Magma asked if that meant they were short on people. He wondered why they didn't just wake up the statues scattered around. Ryusui laughed because they apparently didn't know about the revival fluid. Senka smiled and said that revival fluid as a concept didn't exist as scientific knowledge in the past. Dr. Zeno added that only those who maintained consciousness while petrified for thousands of years could be revived using a dash of nitric acid, and only his people, the select few, had managed to do that. However, he knew they were several dozens in number, and he couldn't believe that those young people were mental champions of the highest order, so he requested to know how they revived the statues. Taiju started sweating and couldn't answer immediately. Ryusui put his hand on Taiju's shoulder and said that the revival fluid was their sole advantage, so they couldn't give it to them. He added that they shot first before asking questions. If they learned the formula, they would create an army to destroy them. Senku agreed with this, certain they would make buckets of it if they knew the right recipe. The factory yielded nitric acid, and the cornfields yielded alcohol. But if they could get those for themselves, they would control the corn city and could make revival fluid for billions of people. Because of this, Taiju responded that they would never get the revival fluid, so their request was denied. Dr. Zeno graciously accepted this and expressed his regret. Just then, they heard a sound coming from above, so they quickly checked what it was. Another aircraft was hovering above their ship. The pilot was impressed by their flagship. Ukyo couldn't believe they had already found the Perseus. Yo was shocked that they had another plane, while Nikki couldn't believe they had assumed the enemy only had one. Looking up, Tsukasa noticed it was just scouting. He said it wouldn't make risky low-altitude maneuvers along the river. Genro was worried that their spears and arrows couldn't reach it. Taiju then asked how they could fight against an airplane. Senku approached the busted plane and said they had their own aircraft. Kaseki was confident he could fix it. He said these kinds of machines really fired him up. Ukyo asked how the plane would take off. Unlike the enemy, they didn't have an airstrip. Senku replied that they would just build one. When asked where, he pointed at the ship. He said it was time for aircraft carrier time. The Perseus was about to get a total makeover. Magma called everyone to evaluate the state of their war. Yo and Mantle approached, while Minami hid nearby to listen to their conversation. Yo noticed that this was the prettified Magma again. However, his way of speaking was too polite, which made Yo say it's freaking him out. Suddenly, Magma changed his speech and told him to shut his freaking trap, or he would kill him. Yo couldn't believe that Magma showed his true colors in just 5 seconds flat. He suggested that Magma should try to maintain his polite persona longer. Magma angrily responded that there was no way, as he was leaving to kill that piece of crap they called Dr. Zeno. He reminded them that they came for corn, and this Dr. Zeno was the guy who had corn. Therefore, the quickest solution was to kill that man. They then asked if kill was his favorite word. Magma whispered that he wished they could use the gun on Yo's hip. If they did, the three of them could solve the problem very quickly. Furthermore, he argued it wouldn't be called a reckless rampage. According to him, it was a well-thought-out strategy, and everyone would thank them in the end. Because of it, the three quickly left to execute their plan. However, Nikki caught them and bonked them on their heads. She single-handedly carried all three of them back. Angrily, she asked what kind of numbskulls would think they could face a machine gun head-on. Magma responded that they had a gun of their own, but Senku explained that the enemy's firepower was 10 billion times greater. He added that it would be a different story if the enemy were willing to wait while they built their own gunpowder factory. That's right, said Tsukasa. They needed to evaluate the state of their war. Minami burst into tears because it was exactly what Magma had said, but she found it more inspiring coming from Tsukasa. The group's manga artist could be seen busy painting. Taiju mentioned that it reminded him of a board game. Matsukaza asked if it was for their war planning, saying it would make their positions clearer. Minami was curious if they knew the enemy's position, to which Ukyo responded that they could guess the direction thanks to Chrome's call earlier. They had gotten a rough sense of distance based on the timing. So, using something like a ruler, they marked the possible locations of where Chrome, Kahaku, Gin, and Dr. Zeno might be. Jinro asked if the enemy also knew their location. He thought they should take the Perseus and escape immediately. That would be pointless, said Ukyo. The enemy had a spy plane. In fact, if they were to sail, it would cut off their land-based escape routes. Jinro suddenly agreed and claimed that was what he was thinking too. Tsukasa asked Yoga what he would do if he were Dr. Zeno, how he would approach the situation. Yoga replied that he would create a pirate vessel. Right on cue, Tetsuya showed what looked like a chip of a pirate vessel. Yoga took it and said that, assuming the enemy was capable, given their advantage with firearms, they would use a small and fast craft to reach them and quickly take control of Perseus. He explained their much larger vessel is a sitting duck. Tsukasa responded that in modern times, that's how real pirates operated. Everyone became worried upon hearing this. Or, he added, they might use a spy plane to locate Perseus and wipe them out from the air. Yoga added that although they might be formidable in close combat, they were still earthbound. Given the enemy's one-sided supremacy in the air, Tsukasa stated they had no chance against it. Ryusui laughed and simply replied, exactly. If the enemy would attack from above, so be it. This would be a dogfight, aircraft versus aircraft. They would turn Perseus into an aircraft carrier, and so they redesigned the ship to make it more suitable for their aircraft. This time, it was all hands on deck for their rapid construction project. Minami couldn't believe they were actually going to build a runway on the deck. She was curious if it would really help them fly. The ship captain answered that an ultralight airplane only needed 20 meters to take off. As for landings, Senku explained they would use wires to force the plane to stop, just like on real aircraft carriers. Good enough, replied Ryusui, asking who would pilot that aircraft. According to Senku, they just needed some remodeling of the plane, which would be faster than starting from scratch. Due to the peculiar expressions on their faces, someone commented that their eyes revealed their true colors in 5 seconds flat. They should just admit that what they really wanted was to build an aircraft carrier. Senku added that if they were going to use an on-deck runway for their plane, they first needed to swap the wheels with ones made from bamboo weaving. Yuzuriha took over that project, Kaseki commented, asking if that bamboo came all the way from Japan. Sure did, Senku answered. It was so handy it was almost like cheating. Moreover, it represented the huge advantage they had over their enemy. Ukyo agreed with this. After all, bamboo wasn't native to the US. Ryusui noticed that instead of wheels, The enemy's plane used glass skis. This might mean they either had no rubber or not enough of it. Senku thought that if they were using skis, it meant they had other landing options in case the cornfield wasn't viable for whatever reason. That would be logical. Ryusui was impressed by their enemy, noting that when they lacked materials, they simply invented a new design. He laughed and commented on how sharp Dr. Zeno was. Suddenly, he realized something, prompting Ukyo to ask what the problem was. He responded that if Dr. Zeno was a sharp tactician, as a pilot himself, he could tell from the way the spy plane flew that this seemed like a big show for them. It was a way of saying they had nowhere to run. He thought Zeno just wanted to keep them glued to that spot, and he was certain his instincts as a captain had never been wrong. Back at Dr. Zeno's HQ, he stated they wouldn't escape. That's why he deployed the spy plane, to discourage them. Meanwhile, Gin was just smiling in the background. A new character asked if they would hunt them down using the plane and beat them until they submit. Dr. Zeno responded that those poor youths were too clever for their own good. They would be wary of such tactics and stay rooted in their spot. But no, he had an even more elegant solution. They would keep them pinned down there and assassinate the enemy scientist. Gin became nervous upon hearing this. According to their new friend Gin, there was only one superhuman science pro among them, Zeno said. And to bring down their kitty kingdom of science, they only needed to take down its leader, who was Dr. Taiju. Gin broke into a cold sweat. He said it was a great idea, but asked if they could pull it off. Stanley, smoking again in the background, responded that he definitely could. Gin was curious about how, but again, Stanley just repeated that he could do it. Dr. Zeno suddenly grabbed Gin's head and said that if Stanley mentioned he could do the job, then there was no need to question it. Stanley put on his mask and left, with Dr. Zeno confident that he could do it. In his thoughts, Gin was deeply apologetic to Taiju. Back at the Kingdom of Science, Yoga said they could give up the corn and abandon Gin, Chrome, and Kahaku to sail into the ocean. He said they could survive that way. Taiju protested, saying they wouldn't do that. Of course not, Yoga replied. But the enemy didn't know that. That was his point. Because of this, Tsukasa realized they could expect the enemy to attack without delay. Senku asked where are their manners. They shouldn't leave all the work to their host when they could bring the fight to them instead. In that case, Tsukasa suggested a small unit. Since Dr. Zeno was their source of science, the goal would be to capture him. That small elite unit would consist of Tsukasa, Yoga, Ukyo, and Suika. Suika was surprised to be included in the group. Back to Gin's perspective, neither side could move their base of operations, and no one could escape. It was a science siege that might turn into a victory for one side. The leader of one group would surely be checkmated. This would be a Kingdom of Science versus Kingdom of Science battle. Both groups prepared, and this fight would be determined by a breakneck attack. Both groups had their plans, finding the enemy science leader and capturing him for Senku's side, while assassinating him for Dr. Zeno's side. Both sides were already on the move, and in Gin's mind, he wished he could warn Taiju that the enemy planned to kill him. Meanwhile, Chrome was thinking of what they could do. Radio wasn't an option since the enemy would surely be listening. Back to Gin, he couldn't move because his guard was watching his every action. Therefore, he couldn't send any message. His situation was terrible. While traveling, Stanley was accompanied by a woman who asked if they could trust this Gin. Stanley responded that anyone who would trust an enemy who double-crossed their own group needed to see a head doctor. They would pump him for intel, but make sure to keep him close. Odds were, he was a spy. The woman agreed with this and said she had obviously realized that too. She was just testing Stanley. She hadn't expected him to be careless, but she just wanted to make sure. The woman glanced behind, which prompted him to ask what's the holdup with Luna. She replied that he was just walking too fast. It turned out there were others following them. One of them said he was carrying 5 more bottles than the other. His companion responded that he was sure the other hadn't filled those bottles all the way, calling him shameless. Luna called them Carlos and Max and commented on how slow they were, asking how hard it could be to carry water. Carlos was curious about why they needed so much water. Max said he wouldn't complain about that, unlike the sneaky playboy over there, referring to Carlos. Luna called them useless. She said if she wanted the job done right, she thought she should just do it herself. Therefore, she said she would carry some bottles too. But Carlos wouldn't allow it. He said he would carry every single one if necessary. Max suggested that she should take a nap while he carried the cargo. Meanwhile, Stanley stated that Luna wouldn't carry anything. That was non-negotiable. Furthermore, carrying bottles would leave marks on her body, and she still had work to do. They were curious about what work he was referring to. Back at Perseus, work continued steadily to build the aircraft carrier. Ryusui noticed the stagnant air, and according to his captain's instinct, it was a bad omen. Not far from the ship, in a tree, spies could be seen. It was Stanley's group using a telescope. Carlos couldn't believe the size of the enemy's ship when he saw it, and Max was nervous about how huge it was. Luna commented that the other science pro wasn't half bad, but still nothing compared to Dr. Zeno. Stanley raised something while Luna asked if it was for measuring temperature and humidity. Stanley replied that it was made by Dr. Zeno, who was being overly helpful, even though he had insisted he could figure it out using his senses. Anyway, he said the extra data would help with accuracy. Carlos asked if it was a weather vane, and Max was curious why they needed those readings, asking if Stanley was playing a weather reporter. Stanley responded that it affected bullet velocity. The three were shocked to hear this. He took out his weapons and adjusted them. Luna couldn't believe he could shoot a target from such a distance. Stanley explained he would snipe the enemy science leader using a rifle made with Dr. Zeno's science. He positioned himself and anchored his rifle against the tree. Carlos held the bullet while Stanley peered through the rifle scope to find the target. Stanley added that he had gotten a glimpse of the area when he was in the spy plane, and this was the optimal firing position. Luna became concerned when she realized they were going to kill them. Stanley replied that it would only be their science leader. Luna asked if that wasn't awful. Stanley gave her a harsh look while Luna grew nervous, and so she said he was just joking, making sure their two wimpy companions wouldn't chicken out there. It was part of her job. Carlos was delighted, saying Luna was as cool as a cucumber, while Max added that he got goosebumps. Luna asked what her job would be and why she was wearing a striped outfit. Carlos commented that it was super cute, and Max thought that must be what Stanley wanted, adding how truly charming Luna was. Stanley explained that each stripe on her outfit was 5 inches wide, and she would be his yardstick. By matching it up with his crosshairs, he said he could easily calculate the target's distance. And so Luna became worried. Stanley added that they were about the same age as their enemies, so they probably wouldn't see her as a threat. All she needed to do was board their ship and find Dr. Taiju, their science leader. 3 seconds would be enough. She just needed to lure him to the deck for 3 seconds and give a sign that she had found their target. He said it would take just 1 shot to finish him. They would kill the enemy science leader. Because of this, Luna went straight toward the Perseus ship. She noticed people were busy inside. She rolled on the ground to dirty her clothes while giving herself words of affirmation. She said she was the smoothest operator and a capable gal. Then she quickly ran toward the ship. Senku and Ryusui became concerned when they saw her. In Stanley's mind, sailing could have saved them, but they stayed put because they were reluctant to abandon their ally, referring to Gin. Fortunately for him, those kids were so naive. And softies like them wouldn't just ignore a young girl crying while asking for help. If they had sent a spy to them, well, this was their counter-op. They would be too playing that game. Luna sobbed and pleaded. She said she was desperate to escape from the horrid Dr. Zeno and his kingdom. Maz was completely smitten by her, and Kirasame commented that this wasn't the time or place for that. While observing, Ryusui thought it was a tough call. Of course, he wanted to help, but they couldn't just take her at face value. Senku slowly came down and asked if she was hurt. Luna looked at him, and he said not to worry because she was safe now. He invited her to board their ship, and Luna thanked him. Kirasame carried her while Taiju went below deck to get first aid. Yuzuriha and Kinro couldn't believe the charm Senku displayed. Meanwhile, in the middle of the forest, the small elite unit was already there. According to Suika, they only had a general idea of where Chrome, Kahaku, and Gin had gone. Right, said Ukyo. They needed intel. If they could capture the enemy's science leader, they could seize the initiative. Any information about the enemy would be extremely helpful at this point. Back at Perseus, Nikki was watching Luna. She couldn't believe they let that suspicious girl onto the ship. Maz didn't care about that because she was so cute. Yo added that Senku was also a guy. If they knew what he meant, the doe-eyed blonde might have pushed the right buttons for him. However, Yuzuriha thought that wasn't it. What Senku was really thinking was that they would extract all the information from this girl. Then they would send coded messages to Tsukasa and the Special Forces. He said it was now spy versus spy. Black-hearted schemers trying to outfox each other. He had already said he knew this wasn't what it seemed. Now we learn that Zeno had earlier explained to Stanley that sniping is the most elegant scientific way to fight. It avoids messy confrontations since only one key target needs to be eliminated. That's why it's also the war method that results in the fewest casualties. Now Stanley can see Luna through his crosshairs as he observes her, and he saw her nod at him. While Carlos was watching Luna using binoculars, he expressed his sentiments as a simp, saying he thinks the bad guys on the ship have fallen in love with Luna. Meanwhile, Max just cursed Stanley in anger for using Luna in a way that could put her in danger. Then the two asked each other how long they would stay in their spot. Meanwhile, Stanley remained intensely focused on his sniping task. Carlos mentioned to Max that as long as Luna hasn't drawn out the target for Stanley, they would surely remain in their spot waiting. Max realized that was why they brought so many water bottles. According to Max, Stanley can maintain his focus for hundreds of hours and stay in one position. Stanley is truly an absolute beast. Meanwhile, Stanley was thinking about which of the people he could see on board was Dr. Taiju. Then from inside the Perseus, someone could be heard explaining about the Kingdom of Science's plan to revive all of humanity, and they were asking for cooperation. This was Minami broadcasting, hoping Dr. Zeno would hear. Minami also said they had no intention of surrendering or becoming slaves, but were open to a civilized discussion. Genro peeked into the broadcast room and asked Minami if the enemy could hear them. Hamura pointed out that they were doing a radio broadcast, and Minami explained that it was still better that they released that message through radio waves, even if Zeno couldn't hear it, and even if they weren't sure what kind of person he was. The ship was quiet and still, docked by the riverside from the observer's distant perspective. But they had no idea that Senku, the true leader of the Kingdom of Science, planned to extract intel about Zeno from Luna. According to Senku, the greatest weapon in a science battle is information. Ryusui and Senku carefully observed Luna. Then Ryusui commented, saying that just like how they sent Gin as a spy for Zeno's operation, there's a 70% chance that Luna is also a spy. Senku responded while he and Kaseki were hammering something on their ship, saying that all that matters is getting the information they need. Ryusui was pleased with Senku's expected logical thinking. Kaseki commented and was happy about the pairing up of a logical person and a greedy person. Suddenly, Luna's eyes sparkled while thinking about her mission. As she watched all the people on deck, she realized it wouldn't be easy to identify which one of them was the science leader, Dr. Taiju. Luna froze briefly from stress, but she quickly regained her focus as Luna, the capable gal. Now she was determined to find Dr. Taiju. The first pair she approached was the indifferent Taiju and Karisa-Mei, who felt her awkward presence. Luna suddenly thought she couldn't just ask questions out of nowhere because most people were still suspicious of her. Because of this, Luna decided to use her profiling skills. While thinking about this, she even performed the gesture of adjusting a monocle as if she were wearing one. The next person she observed was Ryusui. Luna understood that Ryusui was the type of man who could use his wisdom to lead people toward a scientific world from their stone world origins. He was likely an intelligent and hard-working person with equivalent convictions. Then Luna's heart suddenly beat strongly and quickly while observing Ryusui because she realized he was her type. While giggling as she went down the stairs, she wondered if she should also look for the man who would become her crush. She even managed to convince herself that her feelings were also part of her mission, because she was a smooth and capable gal. While going down the stairs, she ran into Yo, who was immediately happy to see a beautiful woman. But she quickly figured out he wasn't Dr. Taiju. Next, she encountered Magma, who had such an intimidating look that she became frightened of him, and she knew right away he wasn't Dr. Taiju either. Next, Luna thought there was a high chance that their leader wouldn't easily reveal himself to an outsider like her. Luna should probably be prepared for a long time searching for Dr. Taiju. Then suddenly Luna heard Yuzuriha calling for Taiju. Taiju immediately responded to Yuzuriha's call, causing Luna to experience intense shock at how quickly she made her discovery. When Luna heard that the reason Yuzuriha called Taiju was to ask for his help in carrying lumber, she realized that Taiju wasn't the type of scientist she had thought and expected. She also thought that if the search job had gone to other people, they wouldn't have been able to find Dr. Taiju. According to Luna, the tricky part of her mission was the next part. Because Dr. Taiju was focused on science stuff inside the ship, he didn't like walking around. So, it wouldn't be easy to lure him above deck. But Luna was shocked again intensely because while she was just thinking about this, Taiju had already climbed to the deck carrying a large log. Luna was trembling with shock while thinking that all she needed to do now was point out their target, Dr. Taiju, to Stanley. We can now see Stanley watching the smiling Taiju through his sniper scope. Then Luna was surprised again when Senku suddenly approached her to introduce himself. Senku's cute smile had sparkles in his eyes while talking to Luna. Kinro commented on Senku's unsettling, charming look. Yuzuriha also thought that Senku would take his time extracting information about Dr. Zeno from Luna. Then Senku suddenly sat in a small chair and smilingly said directly to Luna that he needed info about Zeno from her and wanted to know everything she knew right now. Luna froze because of this, and Kirisame, Kinro, and Yuzuriha were so shocked that their snot bursted from their nose. Because of what happened, Ryusui called Senku to stop him from interrogating Luna. Senku wasn't pleased because according to him, his interrogation seemed to be going well. But Ryusui answered him and said that Francois should be assigned to ensure their guest Luna feels their warm welcome. Francois said that because they needed the lady to open her heart to them, they needed to take her to Bar Francois. Ryusui backed up Francois' suggestion and said that fulfilling desires is the trick to winning over a person. According to Francois, they didn't know Luna's desires, but they could guess them. So, Ryusui suggested something that was least likely to be rejected by anyone. And this was a bowl of ice cream. It even came with a wafer and a cherry on top. Senku asked Ryusui if he had data to back up his claim. He answered that he had research as a desire specialist. Minami agreed with their leader's plan because she couldn't imagine having an anti-ice cream faction in the area. Yo was drooling at the idea of ice cream and said only a madman would have hatred for ice cream. From inside the storage of ingredients, Francois would take what they needed to make ice cream, and it was simple: milk, sugar, and kudzu powder instead of gelatin. This was to achieve a smooth and velvety mouthfeel. They started making the ice cream, and Senku said that because they needed to make vanilla essence, their task was becoming even more difficult. Yuzuriha mentioned that she remembered this also gave her trouble for Valentine's Day before. Senku explained that vanilla beans don't grow in the United States, so they needed to synthesize the flavor using science. First, Senku wrapped copper wire around a test tube. Next, he inserted a piece of iron inside it. Then he connected it to their cell phone's high-voltage battery before switching it on. Ginro was amazed when he saw it glow purple. Luna peeked through the mobile lab's window to see what Senku's group planned to do. Then we see Senku not smiling much because there was a terrible smell coming from what they were doing inside. According to Minami, it smelled as bad as a swimming pool, and according to Ryusui, it smelled more like a photocopy machine. Then Senku told everyone that what they smelled was ozone. Everyone shouted and asked if they weren't supposed to be making ice cream. So Senku proceeded with the next steps, starting with getting bay laurel extract. He boiled it in sodium hydroxide and infused it with the ozone they had just made. And the result was vanilla essence. Minami was surprised that making vanilla essence was that easy. Hamura fell in love with its sweet smell. Next, they mixed all the ingredients and placed them on top of lots of ice. Francois poured salt on the ice, while Taiju stirred the mixture extremely fast. Senku explained that when you add salt to ice, its temperature drops by several dozen degrees. Luna suddenly panicked when she saw Taiju again and thought she needed to get close to Taiju and point him out to Stanley. But before Luna could move, Nikki immediately stopped her, saying she should just be resting. Luna was scared of Nikki's intimidating presence, so she just froze. After they chilled their mixture, Francois served the soft-serve ice cream in wafer cones. As Luna slowly brought her ice cream to her mouth, We can see in the reaction of the Ishigami villagers the intense excitement and happiness from their first-time experience of tasting ice cream. Luna was so happy she couldn't stop tears from flowing from her eyes. Later that night, while Senku was sitting on the rooftop, Luna asked him how he made vanilla using his electric equipment. Senku explained that there's always a workaround for any shortage they might have. In fact, humans have been persevering with this kind of living for 2 million years. Acquiring raw materials that make up their world helps them create things they had no business having. And this is exactly the sweet side of organic chemistry. Because of what Senku said, Luna's heart suddenly beat strongly, which startled her. In her mind, she shouldn't be falling for Senku because her type was intellectual types, especially since she knew Dr. Taiju was their leader. Luna quickly regained her composure and just pretended to be impressed with Senku's job well done. So she borrowed Zeno's favorite word whenever he was impressed, and this word was elegant. Senku's eyes widened in shock at what he heard. So, he asked Luna if Dr. Zeno was a former NASA scientist. Luna was surprised by the question and asked Senku back how he knew that. And this reaction from Luna was already a confirmation that Senku's suspicion was correct. People were speechless because it seemed Senku already knew their enemy. And Ryusui asked Senku who Zeno really was. Senku explained that when he was just starting to make rockets as a kid scientist, Dr. Zeno was his science mentor. In this memory, Senku took us to a flashback when he and Taiju were only 10 years old. Taiju was watching Senku conduct his science experiment on the riverbanks, and when Senku pressed the button, it suddenly caused a loud explosion that launched a rocket towards the middle of the large river. This startled a dog and a jogger nearby. At just 10 years old, Senku was already tinkering with literal rocket science. And whenever Taiju accompanied him, Taiju's brain would always short-circuit from the books he was reading. In his excitement, he threw the book when he saw that Senku could actually research rocket-making secrets from a computer. Taiju was extremely impressed to realize that Senku could understand the English language. But Senku pointed out that his level of English understanding wasn't that high yet, so he still needed to use a dictionary whenever he studied, especially since most academic papers were only available in English. But while typing on the keyboard, Senku said that gathering data through research still takes longer compared to quickly collecting information from various like-minded people in the world of science. Taiju was impressed again because what Senku was doing was group sending emails to different parts of the world. Senku just scratched his ear and told Taiju to just call him Spam Mail Senku. Here we are now at NASA Johnson Space Center, where an office received emails from school kids. The black scientist mentioned to his office mates the question written in one of them. If space is black, why is the sky blue? The old lady said it was adorable and she would make sure to answer the little tyke's email. The black scientist then opened the email that came from a young boy in Japan. The old lady saw that Senku was the child's name and thought the child must have struggled to write in English. An old man scientist joined in, also excited to see Senku's email. But when they opened the full email, it turned out to be a super long and super intricate message about Senku's rocket research. After a short while, other scientists in the office flocked to the table where they read Senku's message. He even explained in it that he put a VPN on the research lab server of the university where his father worked so he wouldn't get caught using the campus supercomputer. The guy was scared because what the kid was doing borders on criminal acts. The old lady couldn't believe the email really came from just a child. But the old man just told them that whatever it was, they shouldn't involve themselves with him. But they didn't know. There was a man observing the whole commotion from far behind them, and this was none other than Dr. Zeno. Meanwhile at school, Taiju was overjoyed for Senku because he received a real reply from a real pro from NASA. Senku calmly told Taiju to pipe down. Zeno said in his reply that he had reviewed Senku's formulas, and he realized that what Senku needed was a niobium alloy nozzle. Zeno also thought that the reason for the data errors Senku was getting might be from using cheap measuring equipment. So he said Senku should first get a resistance thermometer with a rhodium platinum alloy heat sensor. And at the very end of the email was Zeno's signature as Dr. X, along with the tagline, "Science is elegant." Senku thought deeply about what he read. Afterward, the two ate cup noodles while searching online shops for the thermometer Dr. X mentioned. Taiju still expected it could be bought from dollar stores. But they suddenly spat out their noodles in shock when they saw the thermometer's price was 500,000 yen. Because of this, Senku flew by plane to America to visit his father Byakuya, who was overjoyed to see his child. Byakuya even cried with joy since he thought Senku visited because he missed him. But Senku just explained with a poker face that he didn't come to America for him, but for his magic card. Then Senku's appearance suddenly became crazy when he got the credit card from his father's wallet. He knew that all astronauts in training in the United States had a special credit card where they were allowed to buy anything they needed for their science experiments. Byakuya was very shocked that Senku knew about this, especially since it wasn't publicly available even on Google search. Next, Byakuya was shocked again because Senku immediately flew back to Japan. He compared it to a reference about a participant who failed in the Transamultra quiz show. Senku just told his father to get with the times because his references were too outdated. And when Byakuya asked Senku when he would visit again, Senku just answered when he maxed out his credit card. Byakuya cried because Senku showed no love for his father. When Senku got home, he immediately used the credit card to buy a rhodium platinum resistance thermometer, xenon gas, phase contrast microscope, and thermal camera, with a total bill of 3.6 million yen. Taiju commented on this and said he had no idea what equipment he was seeing in front of him, but they looked expensive. Senku said that each one of these was a must-have, and Senku added that he would buy anything he needed from now on. He was very excited because now he had access to a credit card that could get him any equipment he needed, and he was also receiving online lessons from Dr. X. He would do all his research, whether physical tests or experimental chemistry, and he would conduct the launch of his rocket from the shoulders that carried 2 million years of humanity. While playing with a scale model of a propeller plane outside school, Taiju asked Senku if his main goal wasn't to make a rocket. Why didn't he just learn science from Dr. X for that? Senku answered that if you already knew which parts of science were useful to learn, everything would become too easy. He compared it to getting rich just from knowing the winners in horse race betting. Then Senku humbled himself and said he still had many knowledge gaps. And before he could finish talking about science, the person he's talking with from his tablet suddenly spoke, and he said science is power. This gave Senku a shock to his core. We can see from the other end of the call that he's from the other side of the world because it was still night there. He continued that he believed he didn't need to explain to Senku that Senku's small rocket was fundamentally the same thing as a real ballistic missile. While highlighting the spacecraft in front of Zeno, he said that using science, the most intelligent of their scientists could lead the ignorant masses. Then he emphasized to Senku that science was truly elegant power. Senku refused to believe and listen to his mentor and said he wasn't interested in those kinds of things. According to Senku, he was just a dummy who wanted to learn every secret of the world and the cosmos. Senku reached out his hand towards the stars and said he wanted to know everything about everything 10 billion%. We can see disappointment in Zeno's eyes because of their conflicting views. Sometime later at NASA Johnson Space Center, we see scientists and astronauts having lunch break in the cafeteria. Here, a woman asked Dr. X what he would do if he was sent back to the Stone Age time period. While behind Zeno was a large photograph poster of the full moon, he answered the question saying he would recreate weapons of science from scratch and use them to rule as a dictator. Byakuya raised his right eyebrow at Zeno's answer, so he asked Zeno if he really planned to become a despot. Then the woman gave a follow-up question and asked what he would do if there were other scientists with him. Byakuya suddenly stood up and spoke. He said that no matter how chaotic the world situation becomes, humanity would always find scientists. Then Byakuya happily said there would always be greedy people who want to know every detail of how the world works, just like his child. Dr. Zeno gave an answer and said if that became the case, he would face other scientists like him in that primitive stone world, and they would find out whose science was superior. Years later, we see that Senku was now a young man, and he was still receiving lessons from Dr. Zeno. And now Zeno was teaching him that a homemade rocket could be turned into a biological weapon if filled with a virus inside. Senku quietly accepted Zeno's mentorship because even though he still didn't agree with his views, he still wanted to learn everything he could from his science mentor. One day we would just see Senku also studying chemistry about sulfa drugs used to fight pneumococcus. Senku also frequently traveled for different research, and he even reached Africa at one point. Here at an African science facility, he learned about the Ebola virus and also about the taste of lion meat. And in a flashback, we see that he had mentioned this to Taiju when there were only 3 of them, including Tsukasa, who had been depetrified. Senku had already been to many different countries for his studies in various sciences, and after some time, the day came when he returned to America again, and Byakuya was overjoyed again at his child's arrival that in his extreme happiness he even shouted about it. But in his mind, he knew Senku's real reason was just to return his credit card because he had maxed it out after several years of continuous use. Zeno overheard Byakuya that he would meet with his child himself, and he also thought about it because he heard that child's name was Senku. Later that day at NASA Rocket Park, we see Senku standing alone and just observing a large space rocket. Then he suddenly heard footsteps behind him, and he was slightly startled by the presence of the person who stood beside him. Now standing side by side were Senku in a white lab coat and Zeno in a black lab coat. They just observed the space rocket in front of them. But not once did they look at each other, and they didn't utter a single word. But we can see in them both the mutual respect from scientist to scientist, each holding their own sense of pride. Then Byakuya suddenly arrived to check on his child, and he wondered and asked why Zeno and Senku were together. But Senku just said it was nothing. He also returned his father's credit card. Zeno just continued walking away back to his office, and Senku also boarded a plane back to Japan. On the plane, Senku peeked through the window to look at the building where Zeno was, while Zeno also watched the plane Senku was riding. This was their first unexpected encounter, 2 scientists who shared mutual respect, despite their conflicting views. Fast forward several months, and we arrive at the time before the World Petrification event. Before that happened, there was already news about birds being petrified, and Senku was aware of this strange news. We can see that he was already studying it. Meanwhile at NASA, Dr. Zeno was talking to an elderly scientist. Dr. Zeno said that the volume of social media mentions based on each region was roughly proportional to the swallow population across the world. From this evidence, it was clear that real swallows had turned to stone and weren't sculptures. The elderly scientist with him said that Zeno's approach was clever because old scientists like them weren't fond of using smartphones, so they wouldn't think of doing that kind of analysis. He said this was the type of science for young folks. The elderly scientist was surprised when Zeno said that analysis didn't come from him, but from a high schooler from Japan. And that high schooler was Senku. Now we can see a petrified swallow being placed in an evidence bag by a scientist consultant. We can see that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention of the United States is now on high alert, with many helicopters actively patrolling. When we get inside the laboratory, we see that the petrified swallow specimen has been delivered. In their study and observation, scientists discovered that the bird's internal organ structure remained intact inside its body. It was impossible for a person to have sculpted this. The hydrophobic material also repelled any water. In the X-ray fluorescence analysis, they could trace only iron and small amounts of gold minerals in the composition of the stone layer made of carbon and nitrogen. No matter what chemical they applied, it didn't give any reaction. There was only a minuscule ion discharge that occurred when touched with nitric acid. The material's hardness also varied from its core to the outer edges, and the finest parts were the hardest parts. In the ultraviolet rays examination, it didn't show any embrittlement either. The scientists couldn't believe how this kind of stone bird came into existence. Its structure was a total mystery, including the origin of the out-of-this-world mineral it consisted of. When night came, the scientists reported everything to Dr. Zeno via phone call. According to them, this was a global-scale phenomenon, and it might even be universal scale. They were desperate for help from Dr. Zeno's intelligence. Meanwhile, Senku was watching a petrified swallow that he submerged in a bathtub full of water. He learned that it had enough density to sink in water, although it still wasn't as dense as a typical stone. While at school, Senku wondered if the petrification material could be porous like pumice. So because of this question, Senku decided to conduct an experiment. Senku was now using a modified centrifuge for his experiment. While holding a petrified piece of bird wing, Senku said that when he makes gasoline from plastic bottle caps, he really uses porous zeolite. But now he would first use a stone wing. Then Taiju suddenly entered, and called for Senku. His arrival was so forceful that it scared Senku's science club companions. Taiju announced that he would confess his love for Yuzuriha after 5 years of building up courage. Senku was pleased and said this was interesting, while retrieving a chemical from the centrifuge. But it seemed he just left Taiju hanging because the experiment using gasoline that he would put through a nuclear magnetic resonance test was more important to Senku. Taiju just smiled at this because he couldn't understand what Senku said, and Senku's clubmates were extremely surprised by this. Senku continued explaining and said that based on the carbon chain distribution, he would get a reading of the depth of the pores and other physical properties. Then there was a mysterious voice that seemed to be convincing Senku to just continue testing and researching. Now we move to America, where we can see that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency is also actively flying drones and flying machines. Inside the camp, an announcer could be heard saying that DARPA would host their Tech Expo today inside the national park. Stanley was at this event, and according to him, that was just a made-up story announced to everyone. It seemed the heads were hiding the real reason why they suddenly invited the elite unit members here at the last minute. They were far from the ocean, but something smells fishy, said Stanley. The big black man with goggles who was with him laughed. He said that America's top-notch superheroes had gathered in one place at a strange expo. And we can also see that some of those he was referring to included a muscular giant woman and 2 intimidating grown men. Apparently, Dr. Zeno was at their table with this elite unit, and he explained to them that the government had a concern now about terrorism using an unknown weapon, and they might also receive a mysterious attack from a foreign power. While Zeno was looking at the petrified swallow he was holding earlier, he heard on his comms a personnel complaining because the info he mentioned to the elite unit was still classified. They pleaded for him not to discuss it out in the open. But he just answered the complainer not to stress, because that info would leak anyway tomorrow after the experts meeting. Next, Zeno mentioned to Stanley that using glass wool soaked in nitric acid as a terminal, he measured the voltage using a potentiometer. But Stanley just interrupted him, already bored with his explanation, and told him to skip to the point. So Zeno just took out his tablet and showed his companions an analytic graph reading. The muscular woman was curious about what this reading was. Zeno explained that this showed the slightest electrical signal coming from mental activity and nothing else. In other words, these were brain waves. Zeno's companions were shocked by this. Then he asked them if this wasn't elegant. These readings showed that the bird statue they came from was alive. According to Zeno, most of the specimens he analyzed were just in a sleep state while their brain waves were fading. But the source of this reading was a swallow statue that was still awake and conscious. Stanley quickly understood that this meant anyone hit by this new weapon could still live and survive as long as they stayed awake and thinking. Then the elite unit's conversation, as well as other officials' discussions, were disturbed by an ominous feeling that everyone at the expo experienced. Even Carlos and Max's flirting with Luna, where Max was annoyed at Carlos giving Luna a platinum ring, was interrupted. This was because that night, there was a mysterious source of light that came from the north and enveloped all surroundings like a bright shockwave. And because Stanley had sharp eyes, he immediately saw those hit first by it instantly turning to stone. He quickly realized this was the terrorist attack that those who called them had feared. He shouted at his companions to take cover and grabbed Zeno by the back of the neck to try to protect him from the light. But he quickly realized there was no way to dodge the light, and their real fight would be what happened after they were petrified. He told his companions that they shouldn't let their minds fade. To avoid the light, officials flipped the tables they were using to use as cover. Max and Carlos did the same, besides sacrificing their own bodies to protect Luna from the light. Then Carlos remembered the ring he bought for Luna, and because it didn't fit him, and he didn't want to throw it away or pocket it, he just put it in his mouth while thinking he would wash it thoroughly later. Next, all 3 of them were hit by the light. Everyone in the world had turned to stone, so no one saw this aftermath, where there seemed to be a titanic tidal wave and solar flares on Earth's very surface. Even the most protected president of the United States, who looked like Trump, and the White House security personnel had no escape from that light. The general and other soldiers at the expo who heard Stanley's order to stay awake were gradually losing consciousness. The world and universe still existed whole, but it was as if the consciousness of each petrified person who remained awake was just in the cosmos. Like Luna, who managed to stay awake just because she kept being annoyed at what happened to her. She still hadn't achieved her dream of dating a super cool guy who would be her partner as the hottest couple around. She didn't want to die single, and because she heard Stanley tell them not to let their minds fade, she didn't sleep or doze off and just repeatedly told herself that she was the smoothest operator. I'm Luna, the capable gal, while Max and Carlos stayed awake thinking they wouldn't let Luna die single. Stanley himself stayed awake, and his mind remained active even though he wasn't focusing on any specific thoughts. This was because of his experience as a sniper. Stanley and Zeno were still together until the end, and they remained in their final position where Stanley was holding Zeno's head. After several hundreds of years, their clothes began to dissolve, and many large trees had grown in their area. After several thousand years, many different natural phenomena had occurred, such as volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tidal waves, and even simple rainfall. But after such a long time, Stanley and Zeno's physical contact was also separated. After all those years, Zeno remained awake thinking about their location where there were many saltpeter caves. There was a lot of nitric acid from here, so there was a possibility it would land on them. He wasn't sure if this would hurt them or help them, but he was sure it would have some non-zero effect somehow. On the other side of the world, we can see Senku is still continuously counting seconds, which at that time was at the 9,157,661,240th second. Let's go back to a flashback where Senka thought it was odd that he and Taiju woke up after 3,700 years, with only 6 months between them. Senku blamed Taiju's delayed revival on his lack of brain activity. The reason why Senku and Zeno were freed at the same time was that both their minds remained active and at max usage. Therefore, they used equal amounts of energy. While still petrified, Zeno had already made a plan for what he would do after being freed from petrification. This was to mass-produce yellow dent corn to make fodder for livestock and alcohol for fuel. The corn belt of the West Coast was limited to one region, and most corn now were just inferior hybrids. But if he got lucky, he might pick up decent kernels somewhere. Zeno also realized early on that there would be other scientists who would figure out the necessity of corn, and they would be drawn here. Now we can see Stanley's statue, which had grown grass over time. It wasn't fate, and it wasn't coincidence either, but the reproducible nature of science, why it seemed like destiny that Senku and Zeno's paths would cross. And after receiving enough amount of nitric acid, they were both freed at the same time from petrification after such a long time. This was why they were destined to meet in one place at one time. Back to the present, one night on the Perseus's deck, Ryusui and Senku were talking about his relationship with Dr. Zeno as mentor and mentee. Ryusui also understood that Senku and Zeno immediately searched for nitric acid when they woke up. According to Ryusui, one of them used science to help people, like Senku's experiments with nitric acid that he used to revive petrified birds, and the other used science to make weapons that kill people, like Zeno creating bullets. In the end, Ryusui just said that was his simple version of the story based on his knowledge. In a flashback, we see the depetrification of Stanley, along with the muscular woman and muscular black man. The muscular black man saw the statues of their other companions still waiting to wake up again. He even laughed because out of their many numbers, only a few of them survived. He commented, "No rest for the weary." Zeno said there was a slight time lag for the others, but they would wake up any moment. The muscular woman commented while looking at a statue that the event staff from that day might have heard Stanley's orders, and that should have been their chance to not lose consciousness. The muscular black man retorted that ordinary people couldn't do it, but they were surprised when a statue suddenly started to crack. The statue gradually cracked, and when Carlos was revived, he suddenly spat out a ring. The muscular man was amazed at how it was preserved, and Stanley answered that when they were petrified, they turned into some kind of mystery mineral, and Carlos's mouth served as a time capsule. Then Zeno stared at the ring, and when he touched it, he was shocked that it was made of platinum and even shouted, "Fantastic, truly elegant." Zeno added that if you imagine things in this stone world, if an MMA champion was revived, they would immediately rule this planet. But with the platinum they preserved, They could make lots of nitric acid and take the initiative with science and military might. With their massive progress, they built a castle-like base. Meanwhile, Zeno was extremely proud that no one could defeat them using his science, and his childhood friend Stanley, who was an expert in firearms. He proudly said that he would rule the world and he believed he could do it, and Stanley agreed when Zeno asked for his opinion. Let's go back to the Perseus floating in the river. While on the ship's deck, Ryusui and Senku were staring blankly at the sky as if deep in thought. Then Luna noticed the group and was curious about what they were discussing. However, she became interested in Senku because of his questions about Zeno. Whatever secret they were hiding, she could find out as long as her interaction with the group was casual because she was Luna, the smoothest operator. She thought to herself when she was suddenly startled by Taiju's shout. Because apparently the one who helped Senku make rockets was the big boss of the bad guys. Then Luna saw Taiju was there with the group and she slowly walked towards him. Stanley could still see Luna through his scope as she approached, and all she needed to do was point out who Dr. Taiju was. She said to herself that this was the whole point of the mission, and she had the ability to finish it while Stanley remained focused, waiting for the signal. Then back to the group's discussion, Senku thanked Luna for the info he got because if Dr. Zeno was their enemy, the Medusa would be their ace against Zeno. Senku's group was shocked by their leader's unethical plan. Ginro asked if it could still be used, but Senku answered it had no battery. Then Taiju asked how it could help. Senku reasoned that Dr. Zeno was the type who knew how powerful scientific weapons were. He would do anything to rule the new world using that. The Medusa was a piece of super science, and he couldn't ignore that. Ryusui snapped his fingers and was happy that it didn't matter if they couldn't use the Medusa because their enemy was a talented science user, and they could make him think the Medusa was like an ultimate invincible weapon. Taiju was happy with the plan he heard while Luna was picking her nose on the side. She thought to herself that she needed to point out Dr. Taiju, but she was hesitating and whispered to herself to just point with her finger to get it over with and stay calm to be smooth. Through Stanley's scope, he could clearly see Luna was nervous and her heart was beating fast. Then she imagined herself fainting from extreme nervousness where Taiju asked for some first aid to help her. She also imagined the scenario of what could happen if Stanley shot a person beside her. But even though her heart was beating so fast, she moved her arm to point but didn't continue, then bowed at the side of the ship and put her finger in her nose and said to herself she couldn't do it. Then Stanley was waiting and observing what was happening through his sniper scope. He saw what Luna did and focused on Taiju, who might be the one she was going to point out. Meanwhile, Luna regretted what she did, why she didn't continue, then held the side of the ship and looked far away thinking she should give a message. Luna burst out with a big pronunciation from her mouth, saying that one of the people she met, Senku, might be Zeno's friend. Carlos saw this but couldn't do lip reading. Then this caught Ryusui's attention, and he suspiciously looked at Luna while she continued what she was doing and quietly pronounced Senku's name. Max saw this and read Luna's lips and immediately reported the information back to their base via radio where Zeno was listening. When he received the information, he was suddenly shocked by what he heard. Then Senku suddenly turned around because Minami called him from the ship's speaker and announced that she was about to send a broadcast, but suddenly heard a piga noise on the radio. She played it through the speaker, and when Senku heard it, he suspected it was a scrambled message using an actual encryption device. The group heard this and Taiju was angry that it wasn't fair. Why were they passing secrets? Ryusui suspected this might be Zeno and his people. Nikki asked if they couldn't crack the code and Senku answered, not without a spectral analyzer. Taiju just said he didn't know what that was, so it seemed impossible. Ryusui suddenly thought the message didn't matter because it started when he saw Luna saying something at the side. He realized that the enemies were observing from nearby. Then in a tree there, Stanley was hiding while his sniper was aimed at Taiju. He thought that this must be Dr. Taiju. Stanley was ready to pull the trigger of his gun and was about to shoot Taiju when Zeno suddenly shouted at Stanley on the radio not to shoot because he learned that Dr. Taiju was just a decoy. Then his memories returned from when he was still with his mentee, and he realized who the real leader of their enemies was. He knew that scientist's name. Surprise was evident on his face when he figured out that Senku was their leader. He fondly remembered Senku Ishigami as his mentee since he was just a child. Meanwhile, Stanley stopped shooting Taiju because he was shocked that he was just a decoy. Then Ryusui looked at the tree because he felt based on his intuition that there was a sniper there, and he immediately let everyone know. In the events that followed, everyone on the Perseus became alert. Zeno informed them that Taiju wasn't the scientist they were looking for, but Senku. Stanley asked who and where Senku was among them. But now let's go back a few moments earlier before Ryusui, since there was a sniper near them. While we can see here that the sniper rifle was ready, Zeno seemed to be running in a hurry. Then Zeno immediately looked at the writings on the chart because he was familiar with what he heard on the radio referring to a scientist. Because of that, he remembered from 1,000 years ago when he discussed rocketry for a very long time with a young boy. We can see here Zeno using a machine to search for a disk from the archives. The disk Zeno was looking for contained data where Senku's voice was recorded while he was teaching him. Then he immediately took the disk using his claw-like fingers because he made sure to record all transmissions, and he was certain Senku's voice was on that disk. Stanley remarked that he wouldn't be able to hear that from his position. Not necessary, Zeno answered, because just using Senku's voice, he could estimate his height based on what the audio graph showed. Then he crossed his fingers as if determined in what he was doing. Then he immediately calculated based on the disc recording, and from that learned Senku was 5'7" with a margin of error of 1 or 2 inches. He also based it on when they last met that he might have grown taller, and we can see here Zeno studying the audio graph shown on the monitor while Stanley was on standby and listening. When the information was given, Stanley locked in. He used Luna like a yardstick to know the target's height, and he saw 3 that matched the parameters. Then Ryusui sensed the enemy was close and immediately shouted that there was a sniper. Because of that, everyone became alert and immediately looked for places to hide, so Stanley was surprised when he saw everyone running away. Meanwhile, Luna was startled why everyone was running. Because of that, she panicked and got confused with what was happening, so she just looked at Stanley's position. Stanley just thought she shouldn't look at him because she might give away his position, but he realized it was actually good that Luna looked because everyone panicked and became alert, and that would be an advantage for him. Because of this, he could now point out who the target was, and when he carefully observed the two, he looked at Luna again, so that's when he knew who the target was. Meanwhile, Senku sensed that a sniper was aiming at him, so he looked around. Because of this, Stanley knew who the target was, and we can see on Senku's face the sudden surprise when he felt someone was aiming at him, which made him look around. Then he suddenly ran quickly to the storage of supplies to hide. Because of that, Stanley commented that Senku was using a geometrical principle to find an optimal point to break his line of sight. But that wasn't an obstacle for Stanley. Because of this, he could now know which position Senku was in, and we can see here based on his intuition where the exact position was. Stanley was aimed and ready, but he had one last question for Zeno if he was sure he wanted Senku to die. He remembered again the times when he was Senku's mentor where he said he could rule the world using science. And if they teamed up, their dominance would be double. But Senku would never accept such a future. Then in the present, we can see Senku hiding in the ship's bulwark while Zeno was in the base's radio room deep in thought until he decided to let Stanley continue what needed to be done, and Stanley didn't think twice about firing the gun. While we can see here the bullet flying towards Senku, he immediately looked for something he could use in storage. Was this potato starch or kudzu powder? It doesn't matter, he said, and immediately poured water in the sack. He added that when starch and water mix, its viscosity increases where it becomes a liquid, but when something hits it, it becomes like a solid. This concept came from an old abandoned research for bulletproof vests that was never used. He mixed the contents in the sack while the bullet suddenly penetrated the ship. It shattered into shrapnel, and the bullet shards continued towards Senku. Most of it hit the sack Senku was holding, and the mixture managed to slow down the impact force, but it still penetrated and managed to make Senku bleed. In the events that followed, we can see here that the bullet hit Senku and there was a loud gun noise on the Perseus's deck, while Zeno's face clearly showed he was serious about his decision, as if without a trace of regret. The bright full moon seemed like a bad omen. Yuzuriha and Ginro were startled when they heard the gunshot, and Ryusui said that the bullet is faster than sound. Meanwhile, Stanley decided his job was done because he hit the target. Taiju shouted when he saw Senku bloody and collapsed on the floor. Then Carlos and Max saw Stanley jump down from the tree. When he fell from the treetop, The two were startled, and Stanley said the job was done and the enemy science leader was dead. He ordered the two to hang back and keep watch, but Max asked about Miss Luna. "Leave her. Help her. Not my problem anymore," Stanley answered. Because of this, Max got angry at what he heard and Carlos worried about Luna. Back on the Perseus, many were running on deck and Luna was panicking because she didn't know what to do anymore. While everyone was shocked and worried about what happened to Senku, Magma and Kinro carried him to the ship's cabin. Then Ryusui suddenly came inside and calmed everyone down, saying that now the enemy thinks their science leader is gone, they can't match them in battle, and now they'll slowly attack until they surrender. Ryusui added that this was their chance to get revenge while the enemy was overconfident, and he asked for opinions if this was wrong. Yo answered that there was nothing wrong with what Ryusui said and added this was their chance, but how could they move on from what happened? And Ginro tearfully said if there was nothing they could do, they needed to dig a grave for Senku. But Ryusui was confident they shouldn't bury Senku yet. When Senku suddenly regained consciousness and weakly pointed out he wasn't dead because the bullet fragments that penetrated him didn't hit any critical parts. Then everyone was surprised when Senku regained consciousness and Francois immediately put bandages on him, while Taiju was crying and worrying, telling Senku not to speak and just rest first. While Ginro felt relieved and even shouted with joy, Matsukaza apologized for having to cover his mouth. Then Kinro remarked that it wasn't wise to shout because the enemy might hear. Then Kaseki held the sack that Senku used to slow down the bullet and cried in amazement when he saw the result in the starch sack. While Senka spoke again, he weakly said that a headshot would have been 10 billion% instant death. But since they probably thought he was the only one who had memorized the revival fluid recipe, the enemy likely wanted to give him a chance to reveal the secret on his deathbed. This was why he knew they would aim for his chest. Taiju again said he shouldn't speak yet. Then Francois repeated Senku's words with translation while Yo was surprised there was real-time translation and Luna was amazed by Senku's wits that even in the midst of chaos he had strength and courage, so she could only cry. Then Senku lost consciousness again, so Taiju shouted again and worried about his condition. While Francois had finished administering first aid, but according to her, Senku needed a trained medical professional more. When Luna heard this, it was like a spark appeared in her eyes, so she approached Senku and held his arm. She thought to herself that she remembered some medical procedure. So she squeezed Senku's upper arm to eliminate the pulse at the wrist because if it stops at a light squeeze that means low blood pressure, and if it needs more pressure then it's high blood pressure. That was the procedure she remembered to check if blood pressure was dropping. Then everyone was surprised by what Luna did and Ryusui asked if Luna was a doctor, but she quickly denied it, saying she hesitated because she was just a medical student. Because of this, she remembered before that she wanted to be a capable gal and look for a smart guy to be her boyfriend. But she only got into medical school because of her father's connections and worked hard so others wouldn't be suspicious. But even so, she didn't understand anything, so she was the only one who failed and repeated the year. Then Luna was surprised because Taiju suddenly held her hand, and he pleaded that no one else could help, so he knelt in front of Luna and begged her to save Senku. Because of this, Luna couldn't say anything and just looked at Taiju. From a distance, we can see here the castle-like base of the American colony. Then from the mountain were Kahaku and Chrome looking at the base using a telescope and searching for a way to enter quietly. They also thought about the base's defense, and Kahaku said she could handle the arrows, but they'd be killed by machine gun crossfire, said someone behind them, and Chrome agreed because their enemy was also a science kingdom. Then they both froze in fear and were surprised, so they turned around to see who spoke. The two were pleased to see it was Tsukasa, Ukyo, Hyoga, and Suika behind them. Kahaku even said they received top-notch reinforcements, and Suika added they followed Gin's flower trail. After that, Tsukasa suggested a plan to sneak through the cornfields at night, but they would be too exposed. And another option was to get closer through the lake, but there was little cover. Hyoga said once they infiltrated the base they would have an advantage in close combat. But Ukyo added that the problem was they needed to capture Dr. Zeno and get out alive. So Tsukasa thought of a better plan, and his decision was to dig, and Hyoga agreed. Kahaku and Ukyo were stressed about the plan, and Kahaku even questioned it, but Tsukasa was firm in his decision. We can see here their idea of a robot mecha digging machine, a reverse Great Escape, and they would dig a subterranean tunnel to the enemy base. Chrome liked the digging machine idea, but Suka said that would be too much work. Hyoga added they needed to ask for many science items for the excavation job, and Chrome agreed. Then Ukyo informed them that someone sent codes from the radio from Perseus, and the codes were 43, 32, 33. Kahaku and Chrome didn't know what the numbers meant, so Ukyo answered that this was the Uesugi cipher, a code system from Kenshin Uesugi, and he showed the notes of codes where each pair of numbers pointed to each element of the Japanese syllabary. Hyoga said Dr. Zeno knew a lot, but he couldn't imagine a non-Japanese person knowing the Iroha poem sequence. Ukyo even laughed and said this was a very analog code compared to what the enemy used. Simple and effective, but should be kept short, or the enemy might crack it. When suddenly his eyes showed shock when he learned the contents of the code, and he immediately informed them that Senku was shot and everyone was shocked by the news. He's still alive, Ukyo added. But even with that bad news, they still planned to make a tunnel to the enemy base even without Science and Chrome worried about their continuing plan. When Ukyo received another message from Senku, 47, 12, 42, he said. Chrome was surprised that his name came out in the codes, and we can see here Senku lying in bed when he remembered again the days he spent with Chrome in science experiments, the geology he taught him, and Chrome's passionate reactions to his discoveries. Then he remembered the words of his adoptive father Byakuya Ishigami that in whatever situation humanity experiences, there's a 10 billion% chance there will always be scientists, because there are always people who want to know every detail of how the world works. And in Senku's last words he said, "You should realize, Dr. Chrome, that you are now the scientist." In the final moment, Chrome realized the situation that he was now the scientist, and you could see in his face the seriousness that he was determined and had confidence in himself that whatever trial comes, he could do it. While observing Zeno's castle from a cliff, Chrome explained to his team that to infiltrate the enemy base, they would craft a secret subterranean tunnel using the power of science. This idea was shown to us, where they would start from the adjacent forest and stealthily crawl from underground to ambush Zeno. However, as the narrator stated, Senku wasn't involved this time after being shot, so they wondered who would take on this task. We were also shown Senku here, who despite being bedridden, was still smiling as if symbolizing his great trust in his friends. We returned to Chrome, where he spread out his equipment to use his bag as a scroll. He wondered if someone like him, who had bragged about using sorcery to change the color of fire, could handle this job. He brushed that thought off and said that was the wrong question because who else was here besides him? So he convinced himself that he was Science User Chrome. He declared he would craft it and would begin by creating a roadmap. His companion's joy was evident here at his courage and determination. Tsukasa commented here that they would need to allocate time for this, at the very least about 2 weeks, he said. After that, we moved to the Perseus, where inside, Ryusui was telling his companions that Dr. Zeno and his men think that by killing Senku, they would eliminate the scientific threat. That meant, he explained, that they might show up at any time and demand their surrender. Magma questioned the part about surrendering and arrogantly asked if those fools thought they would just give up. Ginro said that perhaps they didn't want that, but what choice did they have? Nikki commented that it would likely happen as Hyoga said, their enemies would use a high-speed pirate vessel to quickly take them down. Who knows if it would happen tomorrow or 1 month from now, Sui said. However, he stated, a quick strike is risky, being patient is wise. They should try to guide the enemy in that direction. In the ship's med bay, Senko caught the attention of the people helping him, Francois, Luna, and Taiju. He whispered to them that they needed to buy time. Using the genuine Medusa that Ukyo had, Dr. Zeno would receive a very special present, which shocked his guards. We briefly went to Ukyo, and after he prepared, he sent an arrow toward Zeno's castle gate where it struck. It turned out that this arrow carried the petrification device called Medusa. Ginro shouted when he heard they would just give it to the enemy, so Nikki pointed out that its power was depleted, to which he just said even so. Ryusui then snapped his fingers and said he understood why they did that. We were shown here one of Zeno's men quickly going to him to show the Medusa, and when he saw it, surprise was visible on his face, while Ryusui explained that a scientist of Dr. Zeno's caliber would recognize a genuine article, and realize it was hypertech beyond anything from the 21st century. Kinro questioned if that would be enough to stop them, to which Ryusui replied not to be ridiculous, saying they needed someone to provide a convincing lie, after which Minami nervously asked who would do that. She asked if she was right that this liar would somehow need to guess their entire plan and maintain the bluff by claiming that device was just one of their petrification weapons. While she was asking if Ryusui meant they had someone in the enemy camp capable of doing that, we suddenly cut to the mentalist Gin, who was acting terrified upon seeing the petrification device that his friends had sent to Zeno. This prompted Zeno to ask him if he knew about that object, to which he stared in response. Following that, Gin explained to them that they had seen several of these on a southern island, which was only a half-lie. He added that those were ancient, foreign artifacts, and fortunately, the one sent to their doorstep appeared to be a dud, because if it wasn't, he and all his companions there would have been turned to stone by now. Gin felt proud of himself for realizing the lie that Senku wanted to convey to their enemies, and he commented that he couldn't imagine any other reason to send the actual weapon into the enemy's hands. The muscular man laughed and asked if this was another one of his tall tales while calling him turncoat. He said he couldn't blame him for doubting him after they caught him lying about their leader. Because of this, Gin started playing dumb, saying he didn't know Senku was the real leader, asking if that meant he was the skilled scientist and not Taiju. He said he was really fooled because those two were inseparable. Zeno recalled an image where he saw young Senku and Taiju just starting to test their modified remote-controlled car. He commented that aside from Gin's credibility, the elegant little machine they obtained surpassed the technology of the old world. Stanley arrived and immediately asked how it worked, how long it lasted, and what its range was. Gin was startled by his arrival, while the muscular woman happily greeted him. Gin apologized to him, saying those details were closely kept secrets of Senku's battle team. All he could say, he claimed, was that he was sure he recalled the sinister Petri beam that zapped them all thousands of years ago and how it was completely unavoidable. If they lost patience and attacked Senku's ship immediately, they would return to being statues, he said, which made Stanley look at him. Zeno said this was unexplained science and they had no method to verify Gin's claim, but that wasn't an issue. After that, Zeno turned to look behind him, which confused Gin. The muscular woman threw away the chicken leg she was eating and suddenly grabbed Gin by both ears, which made him nervous. The woman also started singing loudly, which made Gin ask tearfully what that noise was for. This woman was so tone-deaf that it was terrible, he said. He even asked if this was Zeno's ultimate weapon of destruction because of how awful it was. They started walking while the woman carried Gin by squeezing his head as they headed to another room in Zeno's castle. Stanley asked here how their you-know-what was doing, and said that once it was ready, Senku's little petrification trinket wouldn't matter anymore, since they wouldn't have time to throw it. At that point, he said he could take over their ship before they even knew what hit them. While going down the stairs, Zeno shouted the name Dr. Brody, calling him his genius mechanic, saying they were counting on him and his golden right arm. He asked if it would take a month or half a year for the completion of what he was referring to which Dr. Brody laughed and asked if Zeno was trying to insult him. It would be finished in 2 weeks, he said, which made Zeno comment that it was fantastic and truly an elegant response. While being held by both ears by the muscular woman, Gin thought that they were building some kind of secret scientific item that Senku and his friends couldn't imagine because they were still hiding this conversation from him. If nothing else, he said, he managed to buy them time. We were shown here that science versus science had truly begun. However, by doing this, Gin said, he also gave time for the enemy's science to advance and gave them a hard time limit. While we were shown here a gigantic thing that Brody was making, Gin added that this was a science versus science craft war. After that, we returned to Chrome's team's situation, where Chrome continued working on the roadmap for their planned tunnel. He commented that obviously he needed help to complete this, so he was counting on them. Suika said she could be useful, and because of that, Chrome ordered her to bring a rope and started dragging it. Kahaku asked here, while peering through a scope, how they would exactly measure anything by just looking at the enemy base from afar. Ukiyo answered that they could do it through triangulation, saying that using just a pair of ropes and angles, they could estimate the length of their tunnel without needing to visit the destination. While making the roadmap, Chrome started to overheat due to the high level of math he was doing. Kahaku noticed he was doing arithmetic there, so she reminded him of the time he was utterly defeated by Senku in their arithmetic battle, teasingly saying that Chrome only knew the times table back then, so would the result really be different now? Before long, Chrome got their attention when he showed them the roadmap, and it turned out he managed to put in the correct calculations for what they were going to do. Sweat was visibly dripping from Chrome due to thinking hard to create this roadmap. Suika marveled at him and asked where he learned to write. Chrome raised what he made and happily said they now had an original roadmap for Dr. Chrome's first big invention. After that, we were shown Senku still lying down and resting in the Perseus's med bay. Then, we were shown Chrome's completed roadmap of what they needed to achieve their goal of making a tunnel to Dr. Zeno's castle. They needed an engine and iron to make a diggerific loop knife, and using Kaseki's crafting skill, he would make a puff-puff machine to create a clean air machine when cloth was added, which would also be the source of energy for their tunnel. Wood from trees to make pillars that would be used in the tunnel to prevent it from caving in. Chrome's companions were amazed at what he showed. He proudly said that the baddest or most awesome part of this roadmap was the diggerific loop knife. When they rotate it, he said, it would dig for them, and asked if he was right that their 21st century science hadn't thought of such a thing. He called this invention the diggerific rotating impelling land-eating loop knife, saying they should take the first letter of what he said for short. When he was just about to point out that it spelled drill for short, Tsukasa and Ukiyo immediately noticed it was a drill, which surprised him because he didn't expect people from the 21st century would already know about it. In the next scene, Hyoga prepared to attack, which caught Tsukasa's attention. Chrome shouted for him not to do it, but using his Owari Otome style, Kenryu spear technique, he appeared to stab Chrome in the chest, which worried Suika and Ukiyo. However, when Hyoga's spear hit the ground, it appeared to be just a shovel. It turned out Hyoga had just used his technique on the ground to speed up the digging, and his companions were amazed at how quickly he could dig because of it, where Chrome said it looked like they could do it after all. Nevertheless, he felt bad because he said they forced him to defile the Kenryu style. Kahaku questioned his use of the word defile, and she said it was the opposite of that and it was beautiful. She then pointed out that diligent means moving forward, stained by the earth itself. Hyoga thought about that, and Tsukasa agreed with Kahaku, but he said they would surely reach bedrock soon, where they would need a blade forged by science, the drill. Chrome agreed with him and told Kaseki to start making it. The loud clanging of metal could be heard from outside the Perseus, and we were shown Kaseki taking something out of their large furnace. He brought out the mysterious spiral sword and proudly invited his companions to observe it. When Ma saw it, he impressively asked if it was for impaling their enemies' guts, while Matsukaze seriously said it was ideal for eviscerating. Gin shuddered at how these two warriors' minds worked, while Kaseki commented that he didn't know how Chrome would use that weapon, but he surely felt it was overkill while crafting it. Minami pointed out to them that it was for digging earth. Ryusui said they needed to send it and the mobile lab to Chrome's location. While loading equipment into the mobile lab, Nikki told Kinro that digging a tunnel would be a major operation, so whoever delivers it should probably stay to help. Kinro said, however, their enemy would surely notice yet another large group. Ryusui snapped his fingers again and arrogantly said that in that case, they would just send one person with the strength of 100. We already know who that is, and it's none other than Taiju. Ryusui pointed out Chrome's location to him here. He left the captain's room after that, and before leaving, he first checked on his best friend. He told Luna and Yuzuriha that he was leaving Senku in their hands for now. Taiju put on his game face and started driving the mobile lab out of the Perseus. While driving it out, Carlos and Max noticed him, so they realized they were dispatching a car, which made them think about whether they should follow it. They suddenly thought simultaneously that they needed to guard Luna, so they pointed at each other about who should go, and because of that, they started fighting. Taiju passed by them while they were fighting and caught his attention. Max shouted at Carlos that he was the bodyguard. So how did it make sense for him to leave Luna? And Carlos was the driver, so he should hurry up, to which Carlos replied that he was right. Max heard an engine beside them, and when they turned to look, they didn't expect Taiju himself to approach them. Taiju quickly got down and politely introduced himself to the two, while the two were completely thrown off by what was happening. Taiju happily asked that it looked like they were ordered to keep watch, and he almost told them that Kahaku was doing the same thing. Carlos whispered to Max that they didn't understand Japanese, but somehow he kind of got what Taiju was saying, to which Max agreed and said it was because of his big dumb voice and wild gestures. Taiju then asked if he was right that if they were really scouts, they would probably follow his car. So, he suggested to them to make it easy and just ride with him. The two were stunned by this and looked at each other briefly and soon shouted why Taiju was doing this when they were his enemies. Taiju answered with a laugh that he didn't know, and it just made sense. After that, Taiju and Carlos got into the mobile lab and started driving. Carlos was bewildered and couldn't understand why Taiju let him ride, while Max hoped he would be safe. Carlos remembered something here and asked if Luna was safe, to which Taiju apologized because he couldn't understand English. However, he said it seemed he heard the name Luna, so he told him that right now, she's taking care of his good buddy. According to Ryusui, Luna might be a spy, but he said he wasn't bothered by that. She agreed to watch over Senku, and that was enough for him. His friends wouldn't treat her badly, and he promised that. Carlos commented in his mind that he still wasn't sure what he was saying, but he noticed that if nothing else, Taiju was a decent guy. We briefly returned to the Perseus, where Minami wondered if Taiju had ever gotten a driver's license, which caught Yuzuriha's attention, while Nikki said he just grabbed the wheel while they were escaping from Maz. Returning to Taiju's situation, Carlos was being jolted around by Taiju's terrible driving. He shouted, "Wait a minute," and asked where Taiju learned to drive. Taiju apologized and explained that he wasn't yet used to driving. He then said that it looked like Carlos was worried about him, so he gave thanks, but he was tough and could endure the beating. Because of that, Carlos was stunned and shouted that was good for him, but he would prefer not to experience that. Carlos took the mobile lab's steering wheel to drive himself, so Taiju thanked him and marveled at his driving skills. After that, he suddenly questioned himself about why he was driving the enemy's car. While this was happening, we briefly went to the Perseus. Here, while Ryusui's team was preparing, Kinro asked if he thought enemy scouts were following their car. He answered that Taiju would meet with Ukyo just before the final location. And even though he would drive through the underbrush at a speed they could keep up with, Ukyo's ears would surely hear them from afar. After that, we went to the outskirts of Dr. Zeno's castle where Chrome's team was camped. Ukyo was stunned here and commented that before he could even use his hearing, he said the one he's talking to had already decided to let the other one he mentioned ride along. It turned out Taiju had arrived here with Carlos, where they immediately tied Carlos to a tree, and he asked Taiju if he could explain. Taiju got angry at them about why they tied up Carlos like that because he was cool for driving him here. Hyoga and Chrome explained to him that the moment they release him, he would run to Zeno's castle and cause their tunnel plan to be exposed, which Taiju understood. Carlos's eyes widened when he heard this, and he gradually became nervous because they were going to make a tunnel. When Chrome opened the mobile lab, he was delighted to see the spiral sword, drone, and engine, saying he would surely finish his job with this awesome mountain of treasures. Taiju said he was happy to hear that. Carlos tried to convince himself that these were just kids and almost the same age as Luna while calling them high schoolers. However, Chrome still got his attention when he started to disassemble their drone. Suika cried at this and asked why he destroyed it, so he explained that he needed the little wings that make wind. He added that if there was no air circulation inside the tunnel, they would die from lack of oxygen during construction. Chrome quickly made a blueprint for how he would create the ventilation machine. Kahaku asked if that would cause noise, so Ukyo said their distance was sufficient enough, and besides, he added, Zeno's factory was running at full power making extremely loud noise, so they could exploit that. Chrome continued assembling the tunnel ventilation while Suika helped him install it there, and Carlos watched him carefully. He saw in him how focused and determined he was to complete that plan. Inside the tunnel, Taiju and Hyoga reached the bedrock, so they commented that manpower wouldn't be enough anymore. Carlos couldn't believe what he was seeing here, saying they should just give up and they would never pull this off. Before long, using cable car mechanics, they sent down the drill they had made. When it touched the bedrock, it immediately spun rapidly, making Carlos nervous while Chrome and the others anticipated whether it would work. When Taiju pushed the drill with his strength, it managed to remove the hard bedrock in front of them. Carlos shuddered at this and couldn't believe they did it, while Chrome commented that they would dig their way to their goal, one earth-stained step at a time. In the next scene, we turn our attention to Perseus. Here, Ryusui explains to his companions that Chrome and the others will handle the ground, but for now they're just floating in the water until they can manage to fly. He added that land, sea, and air supremacy would decide their battle, so they couldn't waste any time in completing their aircraft carrier and airplane. Kaseki then asked if it was correct that only Senku could make the finishing touches. While he was asking this, we shifted to the weakened Senku as he explained what the finishing touches on the aircraft carrier would be. He said they would finish up using castor bean oil. After that, they would split the hulls and order Magma and the other bruisers to crush them. Yuzuriha became worried because he should be resting instead of talking. After Francois wrote down the details about Senku's condition, she apologized to Luna and her patient, because despite their best efforts, Senku couldn't simply relinquish his role as science commander. Therefore, she said she would take it upon herself to relay his commands to help with his smooth recovery. Senku was stunned silent because now they were all busy trying to help him get back into fighting shape. Luna stared at him, and soon after searched for the stethoscope to check the condition of his lungs. While doing this, Luna couldn't believe that Senku was almost the same age as her, but he had managed to start alone in this stone world and built everything she could see, one diligent step at a time. She said to herself that her first impression about the smart-talking guy Senku was correct. This was really him, she said, and she even called him Dr. Senku. She said she couldn't let him die because it would be better if no one died here, and Senku was truly important. She heard that his left lung was weakening, so she thought blood was accumulating there. Weakly, Senku suggested that Luna should stab him with a syringe there and suck it out, which shocked her, as well as Ginro. Luna took out a syringe and tremblingly said in her mind that she was Luna, the smoothest operator and the capable gal. Senku explained to her that if his breathing remained weak after Luna sucked out the blood, it would mean he had a cut that was actively bleeding in his lung. If that was the case, he said they should ignore the pooling blood and find a way to stop the bleeding. Either way, he said he needed a transfusion, so they should find someone with blood type AB. Jinro was completely bewildered when he heard this and said he wasn't ready to learn English, and also asked Luna if she also couldn't understand what Senku was saying. While Luna was staring at him, Senku spoke to her and said he knew she was their enemy, but she was all he had. Luna then made one request and explained that she didn't need an answer now, and he should just say he'd think about it because that would be enough for her to get through this. The weakened Senku grinned and asked what her demand was, and if it was total surrender, then too bad because that wouldn't happen. Luna suddenly asked if when he got better, could he be her boyfriend?
Nani?
There was an awkward silence, but soon after, Senku was completely stunned by what he heard. While this was happening, we shifted to the progress of Chrome and his team's drilling. Tsukasa commented that their work would be easier if they knew the layout of the fortress, to which Hyoga agreed and said that they wouldn't be happy if their tunnel ended up right in the enemy's barracks. Taiju heard them, and because of that, he decided to approach Carlos and cheerfully asked if he could make a map of Dr. Zeno's castle for them. Carlos fell silent at that but quickly shouted that it was obvious he wouldn't do that because they were enemies, so Taiju became sad and thought that it was fair enough. Their communications device rang, and when Ukyo answered it, he heard the voice of a woman he wasn't familiar with, so he asked who it was. The woman told them the numbers 35, 11, and 14, and here Carlos noticed it was Luna, so he wondered what she was saying. When Ukyo and Carlos decoded what they heard, they both suddenly became speechless as if their souls had left their bodies. Carlos started sobbing at this, which shocked Chrome and Kahaku, and they asked why he was becoming emotional. It turns out this was because Luna had told them she had found a boyfriend, which is Senku. Taiju was overjoyed when he heard that. Carlos continued crying. Chrome asked if someone could explain to him what was happening, while Kahaku said she had a decent idea, but clearly it wasn't good at the very least. After sobbing, Carlos's expression suddenly turned serious, and he took the brush from Taiju's hands with his mouth while saying that the situation had changed. He said that he and Max would cross hell and back for Luna, and they would be her allies until the bitter end. Taiju removed his bindings, and he immediately began drawing the map of Dr. Zeno's castle. Hidyoga praised Carlos for this and said that once they safely reached inside the castle, their inside man Gin could guide them. However, Suika asked, since Gin was already inside, how would they tell him about their plan? To which Chrome got it and said he didn't know they were using the Uesugi cipher, which might sound like random numbers to him. Kahaku boasted and asked if they were talking about that untrustworthy smooth talker, and said he would figure it out, so they just needed to trust him. Because of this, Chrome pointed out again how they could trust someone who was so untrustworthy. While that was happening, we shifted to where Gin was, and here he was being watched by a muscular woman who was with Dr. Zeno. It turns out he had a communications device made into a bracelet connected to an earphone so it wouldn't be noticed. He heard the numbers Luna said earlier, so he started thinking about what kind of simple code that was that Dr. Zeno couldn't decipher, is practical, and that he could figure out. Soon after, he grinned because he realized they were using the Uesugi cipher there. Suddenly, he heard a loud thud around him that startled him and made the woman turn around. We were also shown Brody and Stanley smiling while looking at something. The muscular woman quickly left Gin in the room and happily ran to where the two were while asking if it was finished. The thing they were staring at continued making loud noises, while Gin carefully listened to that sound. In Dr. Zeno's situation, he was overjoyed. He praised Brody and said that what he did was elegant, and their project for the final battle would be ready to use the day after tomorrow. Concern was visible on Gin's face as he thought about what kind of thing these adult scientists had made, because whatever it was bad news for them. A secret stone world weapon that not even Senku and his friends could imagine. We shifted back to Perseus, and here Luna appeared to be sweating while drinking a beverage at the bar. She nervously asked Francois if it was correct that she and Senku were officially dating, and also asked what dating meant, to which Francois said that was truly a philosophical question. Luna said it seemed like nothing had changed because they couldn't go out and couldn't even hold hands, but she quickly covered up her feelings by saying that of course as such a smooth operator it was obvious she wasn't bothered by that. But as a capable gal, she said it was also okay to have different opinions, and she also requested Francois to interpret what she would say. She asked if it was right that Francois wouldn't tell her that Senku was 10 billion% unconcerned about dating, and would say anything she wanted to hear to accomplish his goals because obviously no one was that out of line. However, Senku's companions couldn't help but react badly, which made Luna fall silent. Kinro explained that in fact, to advance his goals, Senku had even gone as far as getting married, which shocked Luna and made her ask if he was married, to which when Kinro added that he had ended it, it bewildered Luna even more because he was a divorcee. While they were talking, Yo noticed something from the forecastle that made his eyes widen. He quickly shouted to those below that something was approaching them and action was about to begin, which made Ginro start trembling in fear. Matsukaze and the others quickly prepared while commenting that at last, the climactic science showdown had begun. It was then revealed that Stanley is quickly approaching them while riding his airplane, and Ryusui shouted that Stanley had kept them waiting. As Stanley peered from the edge of the trees, it turns out their aircraft carrier was ready, which made Ryusui so confident. They brought out Stanley's airplane that they had scrapped earlier, and Senku and Ryusui boarded it. Ryusui commented that Stanley should make sure to do his best at piloting, because in this battle they would avenge Senku, to which Senku said he wasn't dead yet. At last, they had acquired the aircraft carrier and plane, and Ryusui started the airplane while shouting that this was a science versus science dogfight. Now that Perseus was an aircraft carrier, they could easily launch the airplane they had acquired. Kaseki pulled the lever to propel Ryusui and Senku into the air, and after taking flight, Senku thought that this catapult would launch them into the sky. Their aircraft quickly rushed towards Stanley, which surprised him. Here began the battle in the sky, plane versus plane. The people on Perseus shouted that this was a dogfight and airplane showdown. One of their companions said here not to get too excited because if Senku and the others lost, they would be shot from the sky, creating countless holes. And Ginro added that their enemy there was Stanley Snyder. The real question, Luna said, was why Senku joined in the cockpit instead of getting bed rest. The sky bout between the two airplanes continued here, and suddenly Senku brought out a machine gun which caught Stanley's attention and those watching below. Minami asked when he made that, so Yo pointed out that obviously they didn't make it, and their only gun was the one Ryusui took from his waist, and we were shown this on Ryusui's hip. We shifted to the airplane, and here Ryusui asked Senku if what he's holding is no better than a club. To which Senku agreed and explained that the second Stanley learns they had no machine guns, he would approach and shower them with lead. Ryusui laughed at that, and said he understood they needed to show false fangs to make this a real dogfight. Stanley commented that Ryusui had guts to charge at a military-trained fighter like him, but if that's the case he would let them and play with them up high, and he would still take them down fair and square. The two airplanes quickly flew close to each other while waiting for each other's moves. Senku turned to look while Ryusui matched skills in airplane maneuvering with Stanley. They rose higher in the air and gained more altitude. It seemed to become a game of tag as they circled in the air, and Ginro noticed this too. Someone interjected and explained that a battle between two fighter pilots was a race to be the first to lock on to their opponent. That meant if you got behind your enemy, you would win. It turns out Mr. Manga Artist was the one explaining this, and he added that was the reason why the two airplanes were circling there. Minami was surprised at how talkative he was, so he pointed out that he had written a military series before. Back to Ryusui and Senku's situation, and while Senku was experiencing flying in an airplane, he commented in his mind that this was worse than the nastiest roller coasters because his body was getting heavy and the G-forces were no joke. Suddenly, a metal part broke off the airplane, which worried Ryusui and made him ask if something broke, to which Senku quickly fixed it while explaining that they had rushed fixing that airplane, which indicated breakdowns were unavoidable, but he shouldn't worry as that was why he was here. Soon after, Stanley managed to get behind their airplane, which caught Senku's attention. Ryusui said here that he only brought their private plane for shopping, but their opponent was an ace fighter pilot, which made Senku comment that he was saying that as if it was normal. Ryusui added that they would lose in a straight-up contest of speed, so he thought that if old Stanley was faster than them, they would use that speed against him. Suddenly, Ryusui braked and turned their airplane, and managed to make an extremely sharp turn because of it. The pull of his maneuver was visible on his and Senku's faces while doing it, while Mr. Manga Artist was amazed and wondered how someone could emergency brake mid-air. He explained that this was harder using that primitive plane, but by making Stanley overshoot like what happened now, Ryusui and the others managed to swap their positions and pull up from behind, allowing them to lock on. However, when they thought they had outsmarted Stanley, he suddenly vanished right in front of them, which surprised them. Stanley quickly raised his airplane higher, which caught Ryusui's attention. Stanley arrogantly called Senku and the others Junior Science Club and asked if they had seen what he would do here. He called this move the high-speed yo-yo, and while their battle was happening, it was explained to us here that this sudden steep climb immediately slows down an individual within the enemy's turning arc, and afterward, the acceleration from the rapid descent allows this individual to position directly behind the enemy. Because the movements resemble a yo-yo, this offensive technique was dubbed as the high-speed yo-yo. Senku commented here that cheating Stanley was still stacking tricks while he was riding a primitive airplane. Ryusui suddenly said that he desired it, which confused Senku. He pointed out that he desired moves and skills like Stanley's. Back on Perseus, Ginro became worried about Stanley getting behind Senku and Ryusui's plane, While Mr. Manga Artist was saying this wasn't good because they were in his sights and could be shot down. In the air, Stanley asked Senku and the others if they now understood that dogfighting was about managing speed, altitude, and energy simultaneously while the world moves. This was a 3D chess match where amateurs stood no chance. After locking on to Ryu Sui and Senku, he said this was the end and the Junior Science Club should prepare to die. He said he would just catch up with them in hell when they meet again. Ryu Sui explained while laughing that he had Stanley to thank because if he hadn't backed him into a corner, he would have gone his whole life without attempting the death-defying trick that he's going to do in the air. Their airplane started ascending while Ryu Sui was saying that he desires Stanley's magnificent skills and technique. He got his attention, and Stanley seemed unable to believe what he was seeing here. It turns out Ryu Sui raised their airplane, causing it to go vertical, and Stanley's eyes widened when he saw that, while Ryu Sui and Senku felt like they were going to vomit and faint because of the G-force they were experiencing. Mr. Manga Artist pointed out that they had gone vertical where their airplane stood upright as if they had flipped up. Stanley was completely bewildered when he thought he was seeing a Cobra maneuver here because they were only using a primitive plane and that wasn't possible. He also thought Ryu Sui and the others would stall and drop from the air. He said he knew what their engine was capable of, and he was sure it didn't have enough power to level out again. However, Ryu Sui and Senku surpassed his expectations and managed to ascend, which made him wonder how that happened. Senku explained that it was 10 billion% true that they lacked power when all they had was Stanley's fuel. This referenced what he said earlier to Francois about finishing up using castor bean oil, and he explained that castor oil serves as ultra-high quality engine oil. Though resource-starved Japan didn't have the crazy oil output that their continent had, they could make up for it using ingenuity and desperate measures. It was shown here that Stanley was just behind them earlier, but they reversed the situation using just that maneuver, so now they were the ones tailing Stanley. While still flying the airplane, Ryu Sui removed his goggles and threw them away. He said here that video games had trained his right hand, so he was ready for a combo move with Senku's science. Senku grinned because of how their situation against Stanley had changed. Ryu Sui grabbed the pistol he stole from Yo and aimed it at their enemy. Senku shouted for Stanley to look at them because now they were the ones locking on to him. Now, Stanley Snyder is in their sights. While they continued flying through the air, Ryu Sui happily declared that this was their chance to end the battle, to which Senku responded that if he made a mistake here, they wouldn't have another opportunity. Ryu Sui replied that he didn't need to state the obvious, but told him not to worry because this shot would definitely take him down. Unfortunately, Stanley began maneuvering his airplane in an unusual way, causing it to sway rapidly. This startled Senku and Ryu Sui, made the manga artist shout, jinking, while Yuzuriha said Gesundheit because she thought the manga artist had sneezed. The manga artist explained that he hadn't done that, and what he meant was that Stanley was deliberately making the airplane's flight erratic. Due to Stanley's maneuvering, Ryu Sui thought that at this rate, he wouldn't be able to land a shot. Inside the Perseus, Genro cheered them on while thinking it was easier to cheer from a safer spot like where he was. Magma started laughing and said that once they shot down Stanley, the skies would be theirs, to which Nikki agreed but reasoned that if they failed to do so, the currently friendly skies they were looking at would suddenly become very unfriendly. Genro shouted when he heard this, saying that was true, and nervously told the duo not to mess up. On the Perseus's deck, Matsukaze watched and thought that this dramatic battle among the clouds had inevitably drawn his compatriots' attention skyward, which was why he was wary of what might be lurking beneath them. It was explained here that due to his strong sense of obligation to protect his lord Genro, Matsukaze had become particularly vigilant. He surveyed their surroundings with sharp eyes, watching for movement in every direction. For that reason, he focused his attention on what lay beneath the aerial battle. However, Matsukaze could never have foreseen what would happen next, and this was due to his lack of knowledge about 21st century scientific technology. While this was being explained to us, we moved to the depths of the water where the Perseus was stationary, and here we could see the silhouette of an underwater vehicle. After that, Dr. Zeno, Brody, and several other members of his group were also shown. It turns out that these adult scientists were so advanced that they had already managed to construct a submarine, which they were now using to secretly approach the Perseus. The battle between the two airplanes continued in the air, and people aboard the ship watched, while Matsukaze kept observing the surroundings. Before long, the submarine peaked above the surface water and immediately caught the attention of the people inside the Perseus. They were completely shocked by this and shouted, wondering what this thing was now. When Minami looked at that object, she immediately recognized it as a submarine, but she couldn't believe it. It was explained to us here that as long as you don't want to dive deep underwater, constructing a basic submarine is as simple as putting a lid on top of a boat, so to speak. Similar homemade submarines were reportedly used by cartels for smuggling purposes in the past. Dr. Zeno's submarine continued approaching the Perseus, while carrying a bomb at the tip of their underwater vehicle. As soon as they got close enough, they immediately launched the bomb at Senku's ship, causing a massive explosion. They delivered it head-on, and the force of the explosion caused the Perseus's bow to be destroyed. Dr. Zeno's crew began throwing grappling hooks toward the ship, and when these held firm, they immediately climbed up despite the thick smoke. Upon landing, an individual with a large body and a sword staff began destroying the room where Ginro and other people were hanging out in the ship. The giant man entered and ordered them to put their hands behind their heads and kneel while calling them kiddos, warning that any funny business would result in them being shot where they stood. Next to enter was the muscular woman who had been guarding Gin earlier, which startled them because of her size. The warriors mustered their courage and tried to rush at these two, where the woman waited for them and prepared to stop them. There was a strong impact inside the room shortly after, and after a few moments, Dr. Zeno's other crew members who had boarded the ship shouted that their surroundings were clear. While the muscular man who had charged at Ginro's group was walking around, he saw Luna and called out to her. On the deck, the muscular woman commented that they only spent about 10 seconds on what they did, so she asked her companion if she could sing to celebrate, to which the man nervously replied that she shouldn't. While this was happening, we returned to the skybout between Senku and Ryusui against Stanley, where Ryusui commented that they needed to deal with Stanley's impressive jinking maneuvers. Senku didn't agree and explained that they were actually the ones who forced Stanley into this, and he also asked if Ryusui remembered how they showed their fake machine gun. Senku explained that this was a science battle. He pointed out that Stanley traded his speed for that kind of movement, so in this brief moment, he was 10 billion% certain that his flight had slowed down, which caught Ryusui's attention. He immediately acted when he understood this and began to ascend, which confused the manga artist as to why they did that. Ryusui said that normally, ascending means a relative loss of speed, but since Stanley had slowed down for them, they could make this climb while staying on top of him. Stanley couldn't understand what they were doing because they already had him in their sights, so he didn't know why they were moving overhead. "This doesn't seem to make sense," said Ryusui, and perhaps that was correct according to his familiar rules of the old world. However, in this new world where they were, the rules were made from scratch. While Senku was bringing out numerous glass bottles with protruding wood and balloons inside, he added that the first ever dogfight was so primitive that it bordered on idiocy, where it was just two people throwing tools at each other. But now, he said, they would make this battle a bit more scientific. Senku took a bottle and pushed the protruding wood, which caused the balloon inside to pop. We briefly revisited Kirisamea's throwing of acetylene gas at Stanley's aircraft that they were now using and how it affected it. One by one, Senku popped the balloons inside the bottles and started dropping them towards Stanley. While this was happening, we returned to the Perseus where one of Dr. Zeno's armed crew members was patrolling. He heard footsteps in front of him, so he immediately informed his companions that there were still people below decks. It turned out to be Maz, who was grinning as he stared at the man. He charged quickly, causing flashes of light from the impact of his weapon, and while attacking, he pointed out to the man that their mechanical gun things were their mightiest close combat weapons. And according to their rules, he asked if they should tremble in fear and surrender the second they point those at them. We returned to the air, and here it was shown that what Senku was throwing at Stanley was DIY acetylene gas for carpet bombing. When Stanley noticed this, he became concerned, while Ryusui commented that Stanley seemed to know the old rules too well. Next, we immediately returned below decks, where Maz had managed to take down the man. It turns out he was with Matsukaze and Ginro, and he answered what the man had said earlier, that they wouldn't do what these men wanted because he thought they wouldn't easily submit as island warriors since they didn't know their rules. After that, the destroyed bow of the Perseus continued to burn. Dr. Zeno spoke to his crew using their communications device and asked if they had commandeered the Brat's home base. He pointed out again that this was science versus science, a new world chess match to capture the enemy's leader. One of Dr. Zeno's crew members shouted that this was their total victory. While this was happening, we were shown Maz in action. In the situation of the captured Magma and Ginro, Dr. Zeno's crew members told them that the aerial battle wasn't just about controlling the skies, to which the muscular woman added her apologies. She added with a singing voice that their mothership was theirs to embrace, and that this game would end with their win. A staggering enemy crew member climbed up to the deck, causing one of the crew members there to wonder what had happened in his assigned sector. Dizzy, he replied that this was too much for him, and he couldn't believe how fearless these warriors were to fight with spears and swords against his machine gun. In an instant, Maz quickly charged after lifting the man up, and used the technique Hyoga had taught him on the man's companion. He commented that he liked the reach of this pipe spear thing, and remembering his sparring with Hyoga, he added that his first experience of training seemed to be paying off. Other members of Dr. Zeno's crew shouted to retreat and regroup at the top of the stairs, but before they could finish what they were trying to say, one of their male members covered in hand grenades stood in front of them. He took his stance and immediately threw numerous bombs toward Ma's group. When Nikki and the others saw this, they became concerned. However, Matsukaze remained unfazed, and while observing the grenades, he wondered if these could cause widespread destruction like the Petrification devices. He explained that hundreds of years ago, he had trained endlessly to defend against volleys of those vile weapons. He took his stance and using his bamboo stick katana, he quickly struck the grenades thrown at them. This sent them flying back into the air above the deck, where they exploded, causing numerous shrapnel to scatter around. Maz praised him for that, and said they were combining modern and ancient moves. The one who threw the grenades became irritated and pulled out an even bigger bomb, causing the muscular woman to immediately shout at him not to use that in such close quarters while asking how many bodies he planned to blow up. Maz played along, and teasingly said that it seemed the man with many bombs wanted to kill all their cute girls. He also asked if they weren't already short-handed, so wouldn't it be better to take live prisoners? If he were them, he wouldn't try anything crazy, but he said he was more than happy to go crazy. Minami whispered that Ma's selfish personality was disgusting, as strong as an ox and calculating to boot. Karisame said he was the last man you'd want as an enemy, but strangely, he was dependable as an ally. After that, the muscular woman told her companions to slow down and look at the sky. It seemed the dogfight up there was coming to an end. We returned to Senku and Ryusui's situation against Stanley, where Stanley's engine had inhaled the acetylene gas, making Senku pleased, while Ryusui snapped his fingers and happily said they had damaged it. Stanley's engine started losing power, and before long, he was forced to crash land. Unfortunately, Senku had broken some acetylene gas inside their airplane. Because of this, their engine started smoking, which left both him and Ryusui speechless. They couldn't hide their expressions when they both realized their engine had also inhaled the gas, and before long, they too were forced to crash land. Ryusui helped Senku get out of the airplane after that, and they immediately saw where Stanley's airplane had crashed down. However, when they were about to approach it to capture him, bullets suddenly flew toward them and hit a nearby tree. Ryusui wondered if Stanley really missed at such close range, while Stanley clicked his tongue in irritation, and when the two turned around, they saw him lying on the ground beside them. When the helmet was opened, it turned out it wasn't Stanley but a woman, causing Ryusui and Senku to stare and comment that this wasn't Stanley Snyder, asking who she was. The woman's camouflage began to come off, revealing her body, and she suddenly proclaimed arrogantly that they were right, that she wasn't Stanley because her captain would never miss, adding that he would only need 2 shots to take both of them down, and that if her captain had shown more of his godly sniping skills, he would have locked them both on their ship, which would have made their takeover more difficult. Senku and Ryusui were shocked by what they heard from this woman. We returned to the Perseus, where the muscular woman said their hide-and-seek game was over, and it was time for the star to make his entrance, which confused Maz and the others. Suddenly, something flew out from Dr. Zeno's submarine and landed between Matsukaze and Maz, revealing it to be Stanley, who immediately shot at Matsukaze point blank. Maz tried to counter with his spinning spear, but Stanley easily deflected it, and in response, Stanley shot Maz, destroying his spear and hitting him in the shoulder. Maz could do nothing but writhe in pain while Stanley just stared at him, then took his stance and commented that he had subdued the enemy combatants, and their work there was done. Dr. Zeno was pleased with this and said he had pulled off an extremely elegant checkmate using his knight. However, this seemed to have no effect on Senku, who sarcastically agreed while questioning his statement about the ultimate knight and asked if he really thought this was checkmate. After that, Senku said he was returning those words to him, and we can see Dr. Zeno's face filled with shock at what he was seeing. As it turns out, Tsukasa had infiltrated Dr. Zeno's castle, and the strongest primate high schooler's weapon was now pointed at the scientist's face. After Tsukasa pointed his weapon at him, Dr. Zeno commented on how intriguing it was how they reached his castle. He said he hadn't heard a single gunshot from his guards, which meant they had infiltrated the place while avoiding combat. At first, he thought they came through the sky, but when he noticed the dirt on their hands, he realized they had made a tunnel, which made him comment on how elegant it was. After that, we were shown the design of the tunnel that Chrome and his team made to enter the castle and how long it was. The guards of Dr. Zeno really wouldn't notice their advance using this method. We then went back briefly to the past, a few minutes ago, where Chrome's team's first dig-up attempt failed because instead of ending up in Dr. Zeno's room, they emerged in the castle's cow shed. They hit a cow there, so it glared at them irritably and asked if they were trying to milk it, to which Suika apologized. Chrome was dumbfounded and wondered how they emerged there, while Tsukasa thought if their calculations were slightly off. However, they had accounted for such an occurrence. Suika was hit by the cow's tail, causing her to sit on its feed, and because of this, Chrome noticed they were yellow dent corn. Kahaku was also pleased about this because once they captured Dr. Zeno and took over the corn-growing operation, they would get all the food and revival fluid they needed to bring back every person on their planet. In the next scene, they reached Dr. Zeno's room's door, but unfortunately, 2 guards were stationed there. Suika quickly acted and disguised herself as a watermelon to deceive them. When Gin heard what was happening outside, he started acting like his stomach hurt and asked the guards for stomach medicine from Dr. Zeno. Soon after, he finally vomited, which disgusted the guards with him and made them tell him not to throw up. However, Gin was just performing a trick, and numerous cards started coming out of his mouth, which bewildered the guards. Because of this distraction, Kahaku and Hyoga managed to sneak attack, where Gin commented that if forced to choose, he would rather be subdued by Kahaku. After that, they opened the door, but unfortunately, the room was full of guards. Luckily, they had the strongest primate high schooler and Hyoga with them, so they easily defeated all of them, which led to their current situation where they managed to corner Dr. Zeno. Chrome was amazed when he observed Dr. Zeno's room and even shouted that this was actual 21st century science, which made Dr. Zeno recognize him there. Suddenly, a loud alarm sounded, which worried Gin because it would alert all the guards inside the castle. Because of this, they quickly moved and tied up Dr. Zeno to take him back to their base. The alarm continued to sound loudly while they were entering the tunnel. When Gin entered, he noticed that the guards were coming and were practically close to them, so Chrome told him not to worry. He took out a bomb and explained that when it exploded, it would solve all their problems. He said the blast from it would send Dr. Zeno across the tunnel while also blocking the tunnel end leading to the castle, so it was a 2-for-1 move. Kahaku was pleased with him because she said they should have known he had a plan. However, when Kahaku asked who would ensure the bomb would explode because obviously Dr. Zeno couldn't do it, Chrome fell silent while looking at them, which made them fall silent as well. Taiju quickly carried Hyoga in their rush to leave the tunnel, and soon after, the bomb finally exploded. Because of this, it launched Chrome and Dr. Zeno while riding on a makeshift tunnel cable car that quickly propelled them to the other end of the tunnel. However, instead of going straight, Chrome's cable car broke here, which caused them to crash land. Chrome wondered what happened there, to which Dr. Zeno commented that it seemed there was a cave-in on both sides of the tunnel. On the enemy's side, a guard shouted to find the exit above ground and stop them there. But while he was just saying his plan, Brody flicked him on the forehead and told him to cool his head while calling him Greenhorn. He said that wasn't the way in this battle. While they would be searching from above, he said those trapped below would run out of air and croak due to lack of oxygen. Because of this, he said both camps would start digging. So this had become a good old digging contest where the first team to reach the middle would be victorious. We returned to the tunnel while this was happening, and here Chrome noticed something about the rocks, so he quickly moved and got a part of the cable car supporter. He put metal on its end, which caught Dr. Zeno's attention. He started digging through the rubble blocking their path, while Dr. Zeno asked if he was correct that Chrome descended from humanity's survivors. Either way, Dr. Zeno said he was truly elegant because he constructed an entire tunnel and enacted a cable car escape plan in this stone world. He said Chrome was clearly a man of intellect, so he should think about this logically. He asked where should he be digging and whose side should he be aiming for. After that, Dr. Zeno seriously said that the ship and his allies were defeated because Stan had taken them over. He got Chrome's attention and added that the real battle was over and he had no intention of ending more lives. He said this was the new world and he was its ruler, and all that remained was for them to become his subjects. Chrome's expression was unreadable when he heard this, but he still appeared skeptical and asked why he should be the one to lead. So Dr. Zeno explained that it was because he could lead the ignorant masses. In the 21st century, he said, idiots believed in worthless concepts like ethics, morals, and politics, which prevented humanity from progressing. He said he was sure Chrome knew these types, like the brutes who would sooner throw a punch than see the true value of science. Chrome fell silent at that and responded that perhaps he knew a few people like that. He remembered what Magma said when they were mining with Senku that he could have led them all because he was the strongest. Dr. Zeno also asked him if it was true that he loved science and believed in its power, to which he responded that of course he did and everyone knew he was the undisputed, baddest top science user around. Dr. Zeno suddenly suggested making him a commander and said they could control the inferior fools he mentioned earlier using the power of science. While they were talking, Brody continued digging on the castle side. Chrome commented that Dr. Zeno wasn't totally wrong. He said meatheads like Magma loved power, muscles, and whatnot, but in truth, he didn't understand why even a little. He said he might not understand it, but different strokes and all that. He said that didn't mean they were fools. Chrome added that he wasn't so high and mighty to judge people for what they loved. Soon after, they managed to break through the rock on their side, and they met with Taiju, who was also digging with all his might. Upon reaching the surface, he immediately grabbed their microphone and shouted to Senku that they had captured the target. While Chrome was telling Senku that they had gotten the enemy king, Dr. Zeno's face showed surprise, and Senku had a grin on his face. While Chrome was saying this on the microphone, the enemies on the ship heard it, so one of them wondered if they were hearing Japanese, while another was confident that Dr. Zeno would understand it. Max also arrived on the scene, and he lively said that Stanley was too cool and didn't need a minute to take over the enemy base, while the muscular woman greeted him. Luna noticed the smoke caused by the crashed airplanes, so she became worried about Senku and the others who were on board. Soon after, Max saw her, and while he was about to greet her happily, it quickly turned to shock at what was happening when he saw her tied up. While Max was processing her being tied up, she whispered to him about what happened, and soon after, Max began to sob after hearing it. Afterward, Max looked around, and it seemed Luna told him she needed a squad to save her new boyfriend when he asked what she needed, to which Luna happily thanked him. Francois crawled closer to them, and Luna started explaining that she could help them with first aid, and Francois added that they needed Kaseki because he might need to dismantle the fallen aircraft. Because of this, Max secretly and slowly removed the bindings from the old craftsman. While removing them, Kaseki commented not to worry about it because he said he could cut those ropes by himself, and he just needed them to tell him about one of Dr. Zeno's amazing machines. Francois then started telling him to imagine a device that cultivates earth using blades powered by an engine, and it's called a tractor. Because of this, Kaseki got excited and his muscles bulged again, easily tearing not just the rope, but also his clothes. After that, Francois and Kaseki jumped into the water while carrying his numerous tools. Max quickly shouted that 2 enemies had fallen into the river to cover up their plan, and Luna added that they would rescue them. After that, upon reaching land, they started searching for where Senku's airplane had crash-landed. While this was happening, we returned to Chrome's team's situation. Here, Gin was saying that now that they had captured Dr. Zeno, no one in the enemy camp could understand Japanese, which meant they no longer needed to use encoded messages. Ukyo was listening to the report of those near the castle, and they were telling him that their current position was west-northwest from the base, and they were hiding near the riverbank. Suddenly, someone above them commented that as long as Dr. Zeno's hands were bound, they didn't need to hogtie him. This voice got their attention there, and when Dr. Zeno looked up, he saw Senku. Senku added here that since his people couldn't conduct a proper manhunt until Stanley's forces returned, he wouldn't resist just for the heck of it. He said he would never act illogically like that, because Dr. Zeno was a world-class science pro. Dr. Zeno's face seemed to gleam when he saw his mentee, and soon after, he lowered his head in awe. After that, they went to a nearby rock formation and stayed there. Dr. Zeno commented that Senku had survived while calling him doctor. Dr. Zeno explained here that Stanley would never fail to make a killing shot, so he was sure they must have used scientific measures to foil the bullet and defy death. Dr. Zeno looked up at the sky and commented that science was truly elegant, while Senku just stared out at the open river. Soon after, he also commented that it had been a few thousand years since little third-grade Senku started sending emails to NASA. He chuckled slightly and said that, however, if Dr. Zeno was hoping to stroll down memory lane, they would have plenty of time to do that later, so for now, they needed to move before sunset. Dr. Zeno wondered about what he said about later and asked where he was going since they had no base to return to. He said his people had defeated their friends and taken over the ship, so they had lost. Ryusui laughed at that and commented that it was true, and since they couldn't go back, they had no choice but to move forward. Chrome, who was watching, wondered about what Carlos and Ukyo were doing, and said wait a minute and asked what that meant. The bushes beside them started to rustle, but it turned out to be just Luna and their other companions. Kaseki was pleased because what they heard on the cell phone was correct, while Luna couldn't decide how to react to Senku being safe, whether to be overjoyed or nonchalant. As soon as Francois arrived, she immediately started cleaning the dining area, which surprised those present with her instant hospitality. Carlos was overjoyed to see Luna again, while Max spoke on the side asking how she was. Luna started imagining how Senku would praise her for her good deeds, which wasn't like Senku at all. She quickly brushed it off and removed it from her mind because she said he wouldn't say that. She said she should be smooth and she knew what kind of man Senku really was. Soon after, her boyfriend arrived and approached her. Senku smiled and praised her because despite everything that happened, she still managed to secretly escape with Kaseki and Francois. Because of this, her eyes gleamed with joy, and she said giddily that she was half right, which confused Senku. Ukyo stood up and said they had everyone they needed in the team to move on, which confused Taiju about their team moving on. They quickly moved back to their ship, and Max explained here that when Stanley, Maya, and the other main forces returned from their mission, they would lose because they were unbeatable. If that's the case, Kahaku said, this was their chance while security was light. Ukyo added that they wouldn't expect them to return right after their great escape. Using their lab vehicle, they all boarded a white boat, and Ryusui and Senku immediately went to the helm. Ryusui quickly started the boat, and asked Zeno if he minded if they borrowed it for a while. He said he would just consider it a trade for the Perseus. They quickly passed through the Sacramento River away from Dr. Zeno's castle, and after a while, they started to pace themselves. Kahaku asked if they would attack Stanley's group from the water, which made Gin comment that she was always eager to enter battle. Hyoga pointed out that if they did that, it would lead to their end. While Senku was getting the microphone, he said their goal was diplomacy. He said this was the first and last leadership summit between Japan and the United States of the New World. After that, he sent a transmission signal to Dr. Zeno's castle. He asked Chrome among all the Americans they had encountered, who did he think was the most reasonable? Chrome answered that he had an individual in mind. He remembered what Brody said earlier when they were stuck with Dr. Zeno in the tunnel and started explaining that while he didn't understand English, but while others wanted to fight, this individual prioritized digging to save their lives. Gin said it seemed he was referring to Brody, their mechanic. Gin agreed with him and said that even though he suspected him of lying, he didn't get angry and just laughed it off. Gin added that much like Ukyo, he's the type who'd rather avoid unnecessary sacrifices. While they were talking, we moved to Zeno's castle, and one of the staff gave Brody the earphone to hear the transmission that Senku was sending. Brody responded and asked if someone wanted to talk. He pointed out that if he was calling for a hostage exchange, he was sorry because the numbers were on their side, and called him Greenhorn. That's true, Senku responded. So to make up the difference and then some, he suggested telling him some info that would make him 10 billion% excited. Senku suddenly shouted if he wanted to free the people who had turned to stone, and started saying the revival fluid recipe of alcohol plus nitric acid, which makes nitol, which bewildered his companions. Dr. Zeno's eyes widened when he heard this, and Brody started sweating at the weight of the information he heard. Senku said did they understand that they could make everything they needed using corn, and this was heard by their remaining comrades who were hostages in the hands of Dr. Zeno's people. He said the people on his ship knew the details, and he was sure they would be thrilled to help him. He said at first they would aim for about 1 million people and build up a massive corn city. He added that their goals seemed to align. Brody questioned his idea of an alliance ensuring their hostages' safety, and pointed out that Stanley would never agree to terms like that. He said he would chase them all to the ends of the earth, which worried Nikki. If that's the case, Senku said, they would just keep running from him to hell, because if he knew, he was a busy man and needed to move on with this plan. Brody commented that they were crazy to think about forging alliances while waging war and building a new nation all at once. Nikki answered that wasn't a problem, and they were leaving the Corn City in their capable hands. We were shown here the flag of the Kingdom of Science dancing in the wind, and Senku full of pride and confidence raising his right fist to the sky. They were ensuring that here in this stone world, they would bring together 1 million people, and here they finally saw the Corn City. Next, Senku shouted at Brody to take his mountain of corn and make an insane amount of revival fluid, and wake up 1 million people. Gin laughed nervously at what he said and asked if he really wanted 1 million, while Ryusui arrogantly said that if their goal was to go to the moon, then they desire a massive labor force. The nervousness was also visible on Brody's face when he heard this. Suika thought for a moment, and soon asked if this meant they would be saying goodbye to their friends in Corn City. Their companions were shocked and worried by what she said, and Taiju started to feel sad when he thought about leaving Yuzuriha and their other friends. Senku pointed out that they had no time to waste before moving on, saying he needed his Corn City people to conduct the Japan-US Leadership Summit. Yo wondered about this and asked if that meant they needed to finish up this deal, while Zeno reasoned that they weren't using the same language, pointing out they would have a language barrier here. Yuzuriha asked who among them knew English, to which Minami responded that as a reporter she had studied English, while Nikki knew broken English and had learned it because she wanted to understand Lillian's lyrics. Minami took the lead in speaking and told Brody that their main request was the guarantee of their companion's safety. Brody responded that it seemed he was now talking to the Japanese president, and explained not to get the wrong idea because they were in charge here, and they had the strength to back that up. However, to everyone's surprise, Nikki started shouting in straight English and told Brody to shut up and remove the ropes tied to them by his companions. Brody tried to talk to Nikki properly that he would do that later, but while he was just saying that before they did that they should give him the secret to making revival fluid, Nikki shouted again, even louder than before, and while calling him Old Goat Brody, pointed out that she already said to free them now. She said they had been through too much to haggle now, so he should shut up. She added that while their enemies were fighting outside, they're supposed to play nice and revive 1 million people for Corn City. That's where their interests aligned, so if Brody was willing to offer his help, she promised to agree to that. She asked if he understood that a civil agreement was their only option there. However, Brody started laughing loudly, which confused his people. Soon after, Brody agreed to their plan and said he liked Nikki because she had spirit. As provisional presidents, he said they would seal this friendly deal. Until they returned Dr. Zeno, he said Corn City would be a sanctuary where they would revive 1 million people. After that, Dr. Zeno's people released Senku's friends from their bindings. Brody asked if Senku heard everything they discussed there, and also said he knew they had Dr. Zeno and were fleeing, but none of them could stop Stanley. Brody thought that maybe Senku and his group were going down the river, so they were bound to encounter their ship and Stanley. So he also wondered to himself how they would reach the ocean. We were shown here Senku with a confident look in his eyes, while Stanley was filled with rage about how he was still alive. Dr. Zeno's people on the Perseus started shouting that Senku and his group were coming from upriver, which got his companions' attention. They carefully observed the approaching boat, and when Stanley saw them, his eyes widened with anger. Rage was visible on his face while he watched them, and he even dropped his iconic cigarette. Senku's boat continued to approach quickly while they were ducking to prevent their bodies from being easy targets. Stanley quickly prepared for their arrival, and his companion threw him a gun, which he aimed at the approaching members of the Kingdom of Science. Maya grabbed binoculars here to better see the situation inside the boat, and when she looked through them, she saw the Medusa tied to the prow of that boat. Yuzuriha and Hamura also noticed the Medusa. Because of this, Yuzuriha got an idea that she quickly explained to her companions. Soon after, Yuzuriha and the others started pretending to panic and be scared because they said the Petri beam was coming, so they should run for their lives, which caught the attention of Dr. Zeno's people. When the enemies carefully observed the Medusa, they quickly jumped off the Perseus to get away from it. However, Stanley didn't fall for their acting and quickly aimed and started shooting at the boat. He managed to hit the Medusa multiple times, which caused it to fly through the air. It eventually fell into the river while the boat continued moving. Because of that distraction, Senku and his group managed to get past Stanley, who was waiting on the Perseus. Dr. Zeno's people's shock was visible at what happened, while Senku and his companions on the boat smiled and cheered. After that, Stanley said he understood it now. He said there was no petrification device, or there was one, but it no longer worked, and from the start, Gin was just lying and it was just a bluff. He then lit another cigarette and praised Senku's plan, saying it's not bad at all. Yuzuriha and the others were glad that Senku and his group got past and would reach the sea. Their other friends who were left at Corn City climbed onto the Perseus, and they started cheering. Dr. Zeno's people were frustrated while watching Senku and his group get away. Taiju looked back at their friends they left on the Perseus, and he bravely held himself back from returning to them. Chrome suggested they say goodbye to them, but Ukyo quickly stopped him and told him to be careful. He was confused by this, so Hyoga explained that if they came out on the deck to say goodbye, he would just be putting a target on his head. He also asked if saying goodbye was worth the risk. While Taiju was staring at Yuzuriha, Hyoga repeated the question if it was worth the risk, to which Chrome shouted of course it was. They raised their fists and loudly said goodbye to their friends they left behind after that, and they did it all together. Their friends left at Corn City showed the same gesture, and determination was visible on their faces at the difficult decision they made. They all wholeheartedly raised their fists in the air, and because of this, they blocked Stanley's sight line to make a shot. Sobbing, Taiju said that without a doubt, they will all meet again, and they would build cities all over the world. Senka smiled at this and commented that going forward, they would play keep away with Stanley and his people while voyaging around the world. We were shown here Dr. Zeno's serious look at him while he was saying this. Ryusui agreed with Senku here and said their next destination was South America. The place where everything began thousands of years ago, the origin of the Petri beam that turned humanity to stone. In the next scene, they continued their journey through Sacramento towards the open sea. Gin suddenly shouted here and said, "Wait a minute. Did they mean to tell him that while they were escaping using the small boat they were riding in, the ultimate sniper, Stanley Snyder, would bring his full arsenal and combat elites and pursue them using their own aircraft carrier?" Gin was completely bewildered while asking this, and he added if they could start panicking now. Ukyo said that if you put it that way, it was indeed concerning, while Suika asked how they would win against them. Senku agreed with something and explained that they would avoid Stanley's vicious pursuit while heading to their next destination. While this was happening, we were briefly shown Stanley lighting his cigarette. After that, we went to the Perseus situation in the hands of Zeno's people. They were fixing up the Perseus and loading it with necessary equipment for their voyage to hunt down Senku and his group. Maya said here that once they fueled up the ship, they would leave immediately to get Zeno. A guard sent the Kingdom of Science people back to the castle with a menacing tone and pointed gun, to which Nikki told him they had formed a peace treaty, so he shouldn't point that gun at them. While walking, Kinro thought that Ginro was the only one still missing, so he wondered where he was. Matsukaze, who was beside him, started losing balance and soon after completely collapsed. Yuzuriha became worried about this, so she quickly approached him, whereupon approaching with Minami, Matsukaze whispered something to them. After that, they started begging the guard watching them that he was severely injured and couldn't continue walking anymore, where Hamura added with a poker face that he was dying and they were too far from their destination to carry him. Because of this, Maya carried Matsukaze and brought him inside the Perseus. Maya told Stanley they would just put him in the med bay, so one person wondered why on the ship and if he would come with them, to which Stanley said there was no issue. He said if he died, they would just throw Matsukaze overboard, and if not, they would make him a hostage they could use against the Junior Science Brigade. While Stanley was saying this, he was looking at Matsukaze, so their eyes locked. After that, we were shown Kinro again, and he was telling himself that they were counting on Matsukaze. In the next scene, we return to the Perseus's med bay, and we can see here that Matsukaze stood up from where he was lying and secretly explored the below decks. In the cargo storage, Ginro was hiding behind a small cage, and his heart was beating very loudly here. Soon after, Matsukaze called his name, which got his attention. He was overjoyed because he thought he came back for him, and explained that he hid but his companions suddenly disappeared, so he didn't know what to do next. Matsukaze commented that he surmised Ginro was still aboard their enemy's ship now. He proudly said that he was right that Ginro planned to infiltrate it and spy to gather important information. Because of this, Ginro was speechless because, as always, it was just cowardice that brought him to this situation, but he went along with it and agreed. He pretended to be proud because Matsukaze had figured out his intricate plan, but now that he had thought about it, he invited him to leave because he said he couldn't do it alone even though he was brave. Matsukaze said that at the very least, he should let his bodyguard help him. However, before he could finish what he was going to say, he completely lost strength and collapsed on the floor because of his injuries from fighting Stanley. Ginro became worried about this and quickly approached him. Here he noticed that Matsukaze was severely injured, and he tried to wake him while thinking about what they should do there. He suddenly heard the engine starting that powered the Perseus, which got his attention, and after that, we were shown that the enemy was turning the ship around. Maya stood at the bow of the Perseus and started singing that the Dr. Zeno retrieval tour was kicking off, and here they quickly started it to catch up with Senku and his group. After that, we were also shown Stanley's serious face and Zeno waiting to be rescued. One of Stanley's companions asked him if they knew where the science kids were going. In the med bay, the woman who pretended to be Stanley earlier saw that Matsukaze was no longer in bed. Stanley answered the one who asked him why not just ask the enemy, since they had the wannabe samurai Matsukaze on board. Soon after, they found Matsukaze in the cargo storage and tied him up to start interrogating him. Due to the language barrier, Maya just showed a drawn image meaning where Senku and his group were going in the world. However, Matsukaze only answered that they should do what they would do to him, but whatever methods they employed, he would never betray his lord's friend by revealing their destination. While hiding behind a small cage, Ginro became worried when Stanley pointed a stone world revolver at Matsukaze's forehead. In Matsukaze's mind, he told Ginro not to show himself, and whatever happened to him now was of no consequence. Ginro agreed with this and just told himself that because his job was just to stay hidden, and thought that was clearly the smart decision. For Matsukaze to get hurt while he remained safe, he said they were both just doing their duty. However, his conscience couldn't take it anymore, and he suddenly showed himself and shouted that Senku and his group were going to South America. When he saw that Stanley wasn't holding a real revolver but just a lighter, he was dumbfounded and realized he did this for nothing. He started getting nervous and apologizing to Matsukaze and his friends. While this was happening, we went to Senku's boat, and here he was shouting that they were heading to South America where the origin of the nasty Petri beam appeared thousands of years ago. Chrome commented here with great excitement that they might even find large petrification devices there, where Senku made a side comment that he wanted that too. Kahaku asked how they could be so excited when they had enemies following them. While they were talking, Zeno was just staring at them, and soon after asked Senku that assuming there were still petrification devices left after thousands of years, did he believe they belonged to the one on the moon? He got Senku's attention because of that, and even Chrome was concerned about that question. Because of their reaction, Zeno realized that they seemed to already know about it, where Senku said he too seemed to know about it, because there was no way he would just let those king-sized radio waves shooting down from the moon go. Zeno explained that the top two scientists of the New World were united, saying if they combined their intellects, perhaps they could acquire the hyper-tech weapon for themselves. Senku grinned at that, and answered that he didn't care about keeping it to himself. Zeno added that he was sure that the two of them could crack the secrets behind the Petri beam and the moon. After that, we were shown a map of the globe showing Senku's group going to South America that perhaps contained the Medusa while Stanley followed them. Senku thought for a moment about the points Zeno was giving him, and soon after he grinned and got a chair. He placed it in front of Zeno and sat there, where he agreed to what he wanted because they had time. He then said that they, Minter and Minty, should exchange everything they knew so far. Zeno agreed to this because he said science was elegant.